She was 8 years old. He was a mafia boss worth millions. She invited him to dinner. He said yes. 3 months later, he destroyed a real estate developer to protect her. But on December 23rd, Dean Miller wasn't thinking about protection. He was thinking about ending it all. 34 years old. Built an empire from nothing. Controlled 6 city blocks. Had everything. Meant nothing. He stood before a toy store window, watching a mechanical nutcracker check a watch that never told time, and understood it perfectly. Trapped in a loop. No purpose. Just existing. His phone buzzed. 9th call in 5 minutes. His empire needed him. He didn't answer. Something was breaking. Something that money couldn't fix and power couldn't control. He pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the cold transfer through expensive gloves, and thought, I'm so tired of being alone. That's when she appeared. Purple coat. 8 years old. Eyes that saw everything. Sir? You look very sad. Dean couldn't speak. Couldn't process this child approaching him without fear. You can eat with us. We don't have much, but we have enough. 5 words. You can eat with us. He didn't know she'd been watching him stand there for 20 minutes. Didn't know she'd decided he needed saving. Didn't know her group home was 3 months from being destroyed. Didn't know accepting her invitation would lead to systematic destruction of the man threatening her family. Didn't know he'd fall in love with this small girl and 8 other children nobody wanted. Didn't know 3 months later he'd be adopting her. Didn't know anything except she saw him. Really saw him. And for the first time in 15 years, Dean Miller felt less alone. What happened next changed everything. Dean's breath fogged the glass in rhythmic clouds that matched his heartbeat. Slow, heavy. The breathing of someone who'd stopped expecting anything to change. Who'd stopped believing change was even possible. Behind him, the city celebrated with violent enthusiasm. Street vendors hawked roasted chestnuts and hot chocolate. Salvation Army bells rang with determined cheer. Children shrieked with excitement at window displays while their parents juggled shopping bags and smartphones. But the sounds reached Dean muffled, as if he were underwater watching life happen to other people. As if he'd been sealed behind glass just like the mechanical figures he was staring at. His phone buzzed for the 9th time in 5 minutes. Calls from associates who needed decisions only he could make. Marcus, his lieutenant, handling a territorial dispute that required Dean's personal attention. Vincent, his accountant, with year-end numbers that demanded immediate review. Anthony, his legal counsel, with contracts awaiting signature. Men whose livelihoods depended on his focus, whose families ate because Dean made decisions with ruthless efficiency. Dean silenced the phone without looking. A small act of rebellion that would have consequences he couldn't bring himself to care about. Let them wait. Let the empire run itself for an hour. Let the carefully constructed machine of his organization discover what happened when its central processor simply stopped. The mechanical nutcracker kept checking its watch, trapped in purpose without meaning. And Dean understood it perfectly, recognized himself in that endless, futile gesture, reaching for something that would never arrive, measuring time that led nowhere. He'd been standing there 28 minutes, according to the Audemars Piguet on his wrist, a timepiece worth $65,000 that couldn't tell him why he'd driven here instead of going home. The toy store had been his destination without being his choice, his hand steering the car while his mind drifted through decades of carefully constructed emptiness, through years of building an empire that meant nothing, through a lifetime of winning every battle while losing every war that mattered. Something about the window display had snagged his attention 4 Christmases ago, and he'd returned each year since, though he couldn't articulate what he was looking for. What invisible thread kept pulling him back to this specific corner, this particular window, this miniature world of perpetual celebration he could observe but never enter? The Nutcracker wore a crimson uniform with brass buttons that caught the light, its painted face holding an expression of permanent watchfulness. Dean's reflection in the glass superimposed over the scene, turning him into a giant haunting the miniature world too large to enter, too fascinated to leave, too broken to understand why he kept returning. His face looked wrong somehow, like he'd forgotten how to arrange his features into human expressions, like the muscles required for genuine emotion had atrophied from disuse. He was 34 years old and looked simultaneously younger and infinitely older, his face smooth but his eyes ancient with the weight of things he'd done and could never undo. A woman passing with designer shopping bags glanced at him, then quickly away, recognition and fear crossing her face in rapid succession. Dean Miller was known in certain circles, his name spoken carefully, his presence noted and avoided. He'd built an empire through intelligence and calculated ruthlessness, had made decisions that kept hundreds employed and dozens terrified, had climbed from nothing to everything using methods that didn't bear close examination. Yet none of it had prepared him for the particular loneliness of standing before a toy store wanting something he couldn't name, needing something money couldn't purchase, reaching for warmth that didn't exist in his meticulously controlled world. The mechanical nutcracker's watch read 11:52, frozen there forever, while Dean's watch showed 6:41 inches the evening of December 23rd. Time passed differently inside the display, where nothing changed and nothing needed to, where the porcelain children would skate forever without growing tired or cold or disillusioned, where joy was automated, reliable, incapable of disappointment. He pressed his palm flat against the glass, feeling the chill transfer through expensive leather gloves, wanting to break through into that simpler world. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the December air, a pressure that had been building for months, or perhaps years, or perhaps his entire adult life, a weight that money and power and success had only made heavier. Dean had forgotten when he'd last felt something that wasn't anger or emptiness, when he'd last wanted something beyond the next acquisition or the next strategic victory, when he'd last looked at another human being and felt anything other than calculation or suspicion or the cold assessment of potential threat. The nutcracker checked its watch again, the same motion it had made 1,000,000 times, and Dean envied its certainty of purpose. Even meaningless repetition seemed preferable to the vast emptiness that defined his existence. At least the nutcracker had a function, however pointless. At least it belonged in its miniature world. Behind the nutcracker, miniature presents wrapped in paper too perfect to be real, sat under a tree that sparkled with lights the size of pinheads. Everything in the display was designed to evoke joy, to remind viewers of childhood wonder, to trigger memories of simpler times. But Dean felt only absence, only the hollow echo of things he'd never had and never would. His own childhood had been a series of lessons in survival, each one teaching him that vulnerability was weakness and connection was liability, that trust led to betrayal, that love was a weapon people used against you. He'd learned to build walls before he'd learned to read, had mastered emotional isolation before he'd lost his first tooth, had created an empire from those lessons, turning childhood trauma into adult triumph. Or so he'd told himself for 15 years. Now, standing before this window with snow beginning to fall, and his empire humming along without him, Dean wondered if he'd simply mistaken survival for success. If he'd built a prison and called it a palace. If he'd won everything that didn't matter while losing everything that did. At 34, Dean commanded respect and obedience from everyone he encountered, but couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him with simple human warmth, the last time someone had smiled at him without calculation, the last time he'd been seen as something other than dangerous, powerful, useful, or threatening. The nutcracker's painted smile never wavered, permanently pleasant, permanently meaningless, permanently incapable of actual emotion. Just like Dean's own practiced expressions, the smiles he deployed strategically, the concern he manufactured when necessary, the warmth he could simulate but never feel. Snow began falling in lazy spirals, fat flakes that caught the light from the store window and turned golden before landing on Dean's shoulders. The cold should have driven him away by now, should have sent him back to his penthouse with its $1,000,000 view and its expensive furniture that no one ever sat on, its chef's kitchen that had never cooked a meal, its master bedroom that held only restless sleep and darker dreams. Instead, he remained rooted, watching the nutcracker, breathing fog onto glass, waiting for something he couldn't identify, something that didn't exist, something that was never coming. His phone buzzed again, Marcus's name flashing on the screen with the intensity of someone who'd called 4 times already. His second-in-command who ran daily operations with brutal efficiency, who expected Dean to be available always, who'd never seen his boss simply not answer. Dean let it go to voicemail, an act of negligence that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when every call was answered and every decision was immediate. When the empire had been everything and Dean had convinced himself that controlling an organization was the same as having a life, something had been eroding inside him. A foundation crumbling so slowly he'd barely noticed, until he found himself unable to care about things that used to matter, deals that used to excite him, victories that used to feel meaningful, power that used to seem worth the price he'd paid to acquire it. The mechanical nutcracker reached for its watch, and Dean's hand on the glass mirrored the motion without conscious thought. For a moment, they were synchronized, man and machine, both reaching for time that wouldn't come, both trapped in gestures that had lost their meaning, both performing functions that led nowhere. The snow fell heavier now, beginning to accumulate on the sidewalk in that magical way it did only at Christmas, transforming the dirty city into something that almost resembled the idealized world in the toy store window, almost made the world look innocent again. And still, Dean didn't move, couldn't move, was frozen not by the cold but by the crushing weight of his own isolation, by the recognition that he'd built a life so empty that standing before a toy store window in falling snow was the closest he'd come to feeling anything in years. A child's laughter cut through the general noise of the street, high and clear, the sound of someone who hadn't learned yet that joy required justification, that happiness needed reasons, that showing emotion was weakness. The sound of uncomplicated delight that Dean could barely remember experiencing, could barely imagine still existed. He turned his head slightly, tracking the sound through the crowd, and saw her. A girl, no older than 8, wearing a purple coat that had seen better years, and a knit hat with a pom-pom that bounced when she moved. She was laughing at something her guardian, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a threadbare scarf, had said. The joy was genuine, uncalculated, the kind of happiness that came from nothing and meant everything. Dean felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen so long he'd forgotten it existed. The girl's laughter was so pure, so unguarded, so completely foreign to his experience that it physically hurt to witness, like staring at the sun after living in darkness, like remembering warmth after years of cold. The girl and her guardian moved past him, the child still giggling, still radiating that impossible joy, and Dean remained frozen, watching them disappear into the crowd, feeling the absence of their warmth like a physical blow. He turned back to the window, to the mechanical nutcracker still checking its eternal watch, and felt the full weight of what his life had become. Not a life at all, just an existence, just motion without meaning, just power without purpose. His breath fogged the glass again, and in that mist, he saw his own face, superimposed over the miniature world, a ghost, haunting a happiness he couldn't access, watching a joy he couldn't feel, reaching for a warmth that didn't exist in the cold machinery of his carefully constructed empire. The mechanical nutcracker nodded approval at its eternal watch. The porcelain children skated their endless circles. The miniature presents sat unopened forever under their perfect tree, and Dean Miller, the most powerful man in 6 city blocks, stood alone in falling snow, watching a happiness he'd traded away so long ago he couldn't remember what it had felt like to possess. His phone buzzed again, Marcus, persistent, needing answers Dean couldn't provide because he'd forgotten the questions that mattered. The Empire needed him. The organization required his attention. The machine demanded feeding, but Dean couldn't move, couldn't tear himself away from this window, this moment, this crushing recognition of everything he'd lost while building everything he'd gained. Behind him, the city celebrated. Around him, shoppers hurried past with bags full of gifts for people they loved. In front of him, mechanical figures performed their automated joy with perfect reliability, and Dean Miller stood alone, breathing fog onto glass, reaching for time that wouldn't come, trapped in a loop more relentless than any clockwork mechanism. The snow fell heavier, the temperature dropped. The mechanical nutcracker checked its watch with unwavering precision, and Dean understood with devastating clarity that he'd become exactly what he was watching, a figure performing motions without meaning, existing without living, moving through life without ever actually touching it. The purple-hatted girl's laughter echoed in his memory, a reminder of something he'd lost so completely he couldn't even name it anymore. Just knew it was gone, just felt its absence like a wound that had never healed and never would. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes, breathing through the tightness in his chest that might have been grief, or might have been the simple recognition that 34 years of survival had left him with nothing that actually mattered. When he opened his eyes, his reflection stared back, superimposed over the nutcracker, over the skating children, over the perfect miniature world of automated happiness. A ghost in the machine, a shadow in the light, a man standing before joy he couldn't access, and warmth he couldn't feel. The mechanical nutcracker nodded. The eternal watch showed 11:52. Time frozen forever in that perfect, meaningless moment. Dean's watch showed 6:47. Time passing with relentless indifference toward his emptiness. The snow turned his shoulders white. The cold seeped through expensive fabric. And Dean Miller stood alone, watching mechanical joy, breathing fog onto glass, waiting for something that would never come. That's when he felt it. A small, deliberate tug on the hem of his expensive coat. Not accidental contact from the crowd, but intentional. Someone trying to get his attention. Dean looked down, expecting to see a beggar or a street vendor or someone looking for money. What he saw instead made his carefully constructed world tilt on its axis. A girl stood there, no older than 8, wearing that same purple coat he'd noticed moments ago, the one that was too thin for December weather. Her knit hat with its cheerful pom-pom framed a face that was unnervingly serious, eyes that held a steady compassion that seemed impossible for someone so young. She was small, probably underfed, but she stood with the confidence of someone who'd decided something important and wouldn't be dissuaded. "Sir?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rush of traffic and the Christmas chaos. "You look very sad standing here all alone." Dean stared at her, utterly speechless. He was not a man people approached casually. His presence usually created distance, inspired caution, triggered that primal survival instinct that recognized danger even in expensive clothing. Children especially avoided him, sensing something their parents had learned to fear. But this girl, this small, observant child, stood before him without hesitation, without fear, with only concern in her wide brown eyes. "Don't be sad, sir," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You can eat with us. We don't have much, but we have enough. You shouldn't be alone on Christmas." The words hit Dean like physical blows, each syllable a small detonation against the walls he'd spent decades building. This child, this stranger, had looked at him and seen not power or danger or usefulness, had seen only sorrow, had witnessed his emptiness and responded not with fear or calculation, but with unconditional kindness. Dean Miller, who commanded fear from grown men, who negotiated million-dollar deals with cold precision, who'd built an empire on the principle that vulnerability was weakness. Dean Miller had just been seen, truly seen, by an 8-year-old girl in a threadbare coat, and he had absolutely no idea how to respond. The woman Dean had seen earlier appeared beside the girl, her hand settling protectively on the child's shoulder. She was perhaps 40, with warm eyes that held both kindness and wariness, the look of someone who'd learned to be careful but refused to become cynical. "June," she said gently, her voice carrying no reproach but clear concern. "You can't just invite strangers to dinner." "But he's sad, Rose," June replied, her eyes never leaving Dean's face. "Really, really sad. I can see it. And nobody should be sad and alone on Christmas." Rose's eyes met Dean's then, and he saw the moment recognition flickered across her face. She knew who he was, or at least knew enough to understand that inviting Dean Miller anywhere was complicated at best, dangerous at worst. Her hand tightened protectively on June's shoulder, but then something shifted in her expression. She looked at him more closely, past the expensive coat and the intimidating presence, and Dean realized with uncomfortable clarity that she was seeing exactly what June had seen: the emptiness, the isolation, the profound loneliness that money couldn't hide. "You're welcome to join us," Rose said carefully, her tone suggesting this was a decision made despite her better judgment. "It won't be fancy. We're a group home, not a restaurant. But June's right, there's enough, and nobody should be alone during the holidays." Dean found his voice finally, though it came out rougher than he intended. "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition if you're invited," June said with the simple logic of childhood. She reached out and took his gloved hand with both of hers, the gesture so natural and trusting it made Dean's chest ache. "Please come. I promise it'll be nice. Rose makes the best soup, and everyone tells stories, and it's warm inside." Dean looked down at this small girl holding his hand like he was someone safe, someone trustworthy, someone worthy of uncomplicated human kindness. He thought about his penthouse waiting empty across the city, about the silence that filled every room, about the mechanical nutcracker checking its eternal watch, and the loop he'd been trapped in for years. "All right," he heard himself say, the word surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise Rose. "Thank you." June's face transformed with delight, her smile so genuine and unguarded it was almost painful to witness. "You won't regret it. Come on, we're just 3 blocks away." She began walking, still holding his hand, pulling him along with the confidence of someone who'd just solved a problem and was satisfied with her work. Rose fell into step on June's other side, her eyes meeting Dean's over the child's head with an expression that held both question and caution. They walked through the snowy streets, June chattering happily about the decorations in various windows, pointing out lights she particularly loved, asking Dean if he'd seen the giant tree at Rockefeller Center. He answered in monosyllables, still processing the surreal nature of what was happening. Dean Miller, who controlled half the city's underground economy, being led through Christmas crowds by an 8-year-old in a purple coat. The group home appeared after 3 blocks, exactly as June had promised. It was a narrow brownstone wedged between larger buildings, its facade showing age but also care. Christmas lights had been strung along the railings, slightly crooked but cheerful. A wreath hung on the door, handmade from what looked like construction paper and ribbon. The whole building radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the care someone had invested in making it a home. June pulled open the door, ushering Dean inside with the pride of someone showing off something precious. The interior was shabby but clean, decorated with more handmade ornaments and strings of lights. The furniture was mismatched, clearly donated or salvaged, but arranged with thought. Everything spoke of limited resources maximized through creativity and love. But it was the sounds that struck Dean most profoundly. Laughter from deeper in the building. Children's voices raised in excited conversation. The clatter of dishes and the smell of cooking food. The sounds of life being lived, of people existing together, of community that money couldn't purchase. Dean stood in the entryway, his expensive coat suddenly feeling ridiculous in this context, his whole presence absurd. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator infiltrating something innocent. He should leave, should make an excuse and return to the isolation he'd earned through decades of calculated ruthlessness. But June was pulling off her coat with efficient movements, hanging it on a rack by the door, then looking at him expectantly. "You can put your coat here too. It's really warm inside. Rose keeps the heat on high because some of the kids are little and they get cold easy." Dean removed his coat mechanically, hanging it beside June's threadbare purple jacket. The contrast was stark, his $1,000 cashmere beside her worn synthetic, his Italian leather gloves next to her knit mittens with mismatched patterns. "Come on," June said, taking his hand again with that easy trust that Dean didn't deserve. "Everyone's in the dining room. They're going to be so surprised." She led him deeper into the building, through a narrow hallway decorated with children's artwork drawings of houses and families and Christmas trees done in crayon with the enthusiastic lack of proportion that meant they came from the heart rather than skill. Past a small living room where a donated television played holiday music and a Christmas tree leaned slightly but sparkled with lights and handmade ornaments. The dining room was crowded and warm and full of more life than Dean had experienced in years. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by mismatched chairs filled with children of various ages. He counted 8 quickly, ranging from perhaps 4 to early teens. At the head of the table, an elderly woman was setting down a large pot of soup, her movements careful and her smile warm. The conversation stopped when Dean entered. Every face turned toward him, eyes widening with various degrees of surprise and wariness. Even the youngest children seemed to sense that he didn't belong here, that his presence was an anomaly in their carefully maintained world. "Everyone," June announced, with the confidence of someone delivering excellent news. "This is, She looked up at Dean, suddenly realizing she'd invited him without learning his name. "Dean," he supplied quietly. "Dean Miller. This is Dean," June continued happily. "He was sad and alone by the toy store, so I invited him for dinner. That's okay. Right, Rose?" Rose had entered behind them, removing her own coat. She met the elderly woman's questioning gaze with a small shrug that communicated both resignation and defiance. The elderly woman, who Dean assumed was another caregiver, assessed him with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then nodded slowly. "Well," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to be her default setting, "any friend of June's is welcome here. I'm Martha. Please, sit down. Soup's hot, and there's plenty." Dean found himself guided to an empty chair. June insisted he sit beside her and watched as the organized chaos of a communal meal resumed. Children passed bread with varying degrees of coordination. Martha ladled soup with practiced efficiency. Rose poured water from a pitcher that had been chipped and carefully glued back together. The sounds of silverware and conversation and simple domestic life surrounded him like water, and Dean sat in the middle of it feeling like an astronaut who'd just discovered he could breathe on an alien planet. June was watching him with those serious eyes, waiting for his reaction, and Dean realized with uncomfortable clarity that his response mattered to her, that this small girl who'd shown him unconditional kindness needed him to understand what she was sharing, needed him to see the value in this shabby brownstone and these donated dishes and this handmade warmth. "Thank you," Dean said quietly, the words inadequate for what he was feeling but the only ones he had. "For inviting me." June's smile could have lit the whole city. "You're welcome. Now try the soup, it's really good. Rose makes it from scratch." Dean picked up his spoon, and around him, the group home continued its cheerful chaos, completely unaware that they'd just offered sanctuary to the most dangerous man in 6 blocks, completely innocent of the fact that their simple kindness was shattering walls that violence and money and power had never touched. And for the first time in 15 years, Dean Miller felt something other than emptiness. He felt home. The soup was vegetable, thick with carrots and potatoes and beans, clearly made to stretch limited resources while providing maximum nutrition. It came in a chipped ceramic bowl with a pattern that had faded from years of use. The spoon was mismatched stainless steel, slightly bent. The bread was store-brand, probably donated, sliced thick, and passed around the table with casual efficiency. It was the best meal Dean had eaten in years, not because of the ingredients or the preparation or any objective measure of quality, but because it was shared, because it came with laughter and conversation and the sounds of people who genuinely cared about each other existing together, because it was offered without expectation, without calculation, without any thought of what Dean might provide in return. Around the table, the children ate with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of the genuinely hungry. A small boy, perhaps 5, asked for seconds before finishing his first bowl, earning a gentle correction from Martha about patience. 2 girls who looked like sisters bickered quietly about who got the last piece of bread until Rose simply cut it in half and solved the problem with matter-of-fact kindness. A teenager with carefully maintained distance in his eyes ate methodically, never quite joining the conversation but clearly listening to every word. June narrated portions of the meal for Dean's benefit, providing context he wouldn't have otherwise had. That's Tommy. He's 4 and he really likes carrots, so he picks them out first. And that's Sarah and Rebecca, they're twins, but they don't like to match because they want to be individuals. That's Marcus. He's 14 and he's really smart, but he doesn't talk much. And that's little Emma, she's 6 and she has a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hopkins that she takes everywhere. Each child acknowledged Dean with varying degrees of curiosity and caution as June introduced them. None of them knew who he was, but they sensed his otherness, the way animals sense predators even in calm moments. Yet June's acceptance of him seemed to provide some buffer, some assurance that if she trusted him, they could afford to as well. Rose sat at the opposite end of the table from Martha, her position suggesting she was more than just another caregiver. Dean watched her interact with the children, correcting without harshness, encouraging without false praise, maintaining order through genuine affection rather than authority. She caught his gaze several times, her expression holding questions she was too polite to ask in front of the children. "June tells me you were by the toy store on Lexington," Rose said during a lull in the general conversation. Her tone was casual, but Dean heard the careful assessment underneath. "That's quite a walk from here. I drive past it sometimes," Dean replied, the truth of which was that he'd deliberately driven there, that the toy store had become a strange pilgrimage he couldn't explain to himself, let alone to her. The display caught my attention. "The Nutcracker?" June asked eagerly. "I love that one." He looks so serious with his watch, like he has really important things to do. Dean felt something twist in his chest. "Yes, the Nutcracker. I like the skating children," June continued, apparently finding Dean an excellent audience for her observations. "They look so happy going around and around, like they'll never get tired or cold or sad, just happy forever." "June has a very active imagination," Rose said, but her tone held affection rather than criticism. "She sees stories in everything." "That's not imagination," June protested. "That's just noticing things. Like how I noticed Dean was sad. That wasn't imagination, that was real." "You're very observant," Martha interjected gently, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from Dean's emotional state. "That's a gift, sweetheart. But sometimes grown-ups need privacy even in their sadness. But privacy doesn't help when you're alone," June said with the devastating logic of childhood. "Privacy is just another word for lonely sometimes. That's what Rose says when I try to hide in my room when I'm upset. She says being alone doesn't fix anything, people fix things." Dean set down his spoon carefully, no longer trusting his hands to remain steady. This child, this small, perceptive girl, had just articulated something he'd spent 15 years avoiding, that his carefully maintained isolation wasn't protection. It was just loneliness given a different name. That his empire and his power and his control were all just elaborate mechanisms for avoiding the vulnerability of human connection. Rose's eyes met his across the table, and in them he saw recognition, not of who he was in the city's power structure, but of something more fundamental. She knew what June had seen, knew what her ward's innocent invitation had exposed, and her expression held something that looked almost like compassion. "June's right about a lot of things," Rose said quietly. "She has a way of seeing clearly that most of us lose as we get older." "I don't want to lose it," June said firmly. "I want to keep seeing people, really seeing them, not just their outsides." The meal continued, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Marcus's school project, Sarah and Rebecca's debate about whether snowmen or snow angels were superior, Tommy's insistence that carrots made you see in the dark, which was why rabbits never bumped into things at night. The children's chatter flowed around Dean like warm water, gradually easing tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. He watched the way Rose gently redirected Tommy's overly enthusiastic eating before he made himself sick. The way Martha cut Emma's bread into smaller pieces without being asked, clearly knowing the child's preferences through patient observation. The way the older children unconsciously monitored the younger ones, ready to help before help was needed. This wasn't just a house where children lived. It was a family, chosen and built through care rather than blood, held together by commitment rather than obligation. Dean's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, Marcus calling for the 15th time, probably with genuine concern now that Dean had been unreachable for over an hour. The Empire needed him. Decisions were waiting. Problems required his attention. But he couldn't bring himself to care. Not here, surrounded by soup and bread and simple human warmth. Not while June was explaining her theory about why winter was actually better than summer despite the cold. Her logic circular but her enthusiasm infectious. Not while this shabby brownstone demonstrated with quiet authority that wealth and poverty had nothing to do with being rich or poor in ways that actually mattered. After the main course, Martha produced what she called celebration cookies, store-bought sugar cookies with colored icing that the children had clearly decorated themselves based on the enthusiastic lack of restraint in the frosting. Application. They were imperfect and messy and absolutely perfect. June insisted Dean try one she'd decorated personally, a Christmas tree that was more blue than green, with candy decorations applied with more enthusiasm than symmetry. "I made this one yesterday," she said proudly. "Rose says I'm getting better at staying inside the lines, but I think the decorations look happier when they go everywhere." Dean accepted the cookie, blue tree and wayward candy and all, and took a bite while June watched with the intense attention of someone whose opinion mattered enormously. It was sweet and artificial and tasted like childhood innocence he'd never experienced. "It's perfect," he said honestly. June beamed. "You can have another one if you want." We made lots. As the meal wound down and children began clearing dishes with varying degrees of competence, Dean found himself helping without conscious decision. He carried bowls to the kitchen, following June's cheerful instructions, navigating the narrow space where Rose was organizing the washing routine with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for coming," Rose said quietly as Dean set dishes beside the sink. Her voice was pitched low enough that the children in the dining room wouldn't hear. "June doesn't usually." She paused, choosing words carefully. "She's cautious with strangers normally, but she has good instincts about people. She saw something in you that needed addressing, and she's rarely wrong." "She saw desperation," Dean replied, the honesty surprising him. "She saw exactly what I've been trying to hide from everyone, including myself." "She saw someone who needed kindness," Rose corrected gently. "That's different from desperation. That's just human." Dean wanted to tell her he wasn't human anymore. Hadn't been for years. Had traded humanity for power so long ago he couldn't remember what genuine feeling was supposed to feel like. But the words died in his throat because they weren't true. Not entirely. Not here, in this kitchen, with June's laughter carrying from the dining room and the smell of simple food and the warmth of people who'd chosen each other. He was human. Just barely. Just enough. And for the first time in 15 years, that seemed like it might be enough. After dinner, the children dispersed to various evening activities, homework for the older ones, playtime for the younger, a carefully orchestrated routine that kept chaos manageable. June, however, remained attached to Dean with the determination of someone who'd decided he was her personal responsibility for the evening. She led him to the small living room where the slightly crooked Christmas tree sparkled with mismatched lights. They sat on a donated couch that sagged in the middle but was surprisingly comfortable, and June immediately began showing him the ornaments she'd made: construction paper stars with glitter, popsicle stick reindeer with googly eyes, her name written in marker on a wooden disc that hung prominently near the front. "This one is my favorite," she said, pointing to a small clay angel that looked handmade. "Rose helped me make it last year. See how the wings are a little crooked? That's because I rushed the clay before it dried, and they bent funny. But Rose said it made her look more real, like she'd actually been flying and got tired." Dean examined the angel, its imperfect wings giving it character that factory-perfect versions could never achieve. "Your guardian is very wise. Rose is the best," June agreed immediately. "She's been taking care of me since I was 5. Before that, I was in another home, but it wasn't like this. Rose makes it feel like family, instead of just a place where kids stay." There was something in June's voice, a careful control that suggested she was managing difficult emotions. Dean recognized it because he'd spent years perfecting the same technique, that particular skill of talking about painful things while maintaining surface composure. "How long have you been here?" he asked gently. 3 years, June replied. "I'm 8 now, so I was 5 when I came. My mom." She paused, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her purple coat, which she'd retrieved and was holding like a security blanket. "My mom had problems. She tried really hard, but the problems were bigger than her trying. Social services said I needed stability, so they brought me here." The matter-of-fact way she described abandonment and loss made Dean's chest ache. This child had experienced trauma that would destroy most adults, yet she'd somehow retained the capacity for compassion, for noticing sad strangers by toy stores, for offering unconditional kindness to people who didn't deserve it. "Rose sounds like she provides good stability," Dean offered. "The best," June confirmed, but now her voice carried a weight that made Dean alert to incoming pain. "That's why I'm so scared about." She stopped, her eyes suddenly filling with tears she was clearly trying to hold back. Dean had no experience with crying children, had carefully avoided situations that required emotional comfort, but some instinct older than his carefully constructed defenses made him shift closer. "Scared about what?" he asked quietly. June was silent for a long moment, her fingers twisting in her coat with increasing agitation. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words came tumbling out. "The home is closing. In 3 months. Maybe less. There's a developer who wants this building, and he's been putting pressure on Rose and Martha. They tried to fight it, tried to find more money. But there's debt from repairs last year. The roof was leaking and the heating system broke, and it was really expensive. Now the developer says if Rose can't pay everything she owes by January 15th, the building gets sold, and everyone has to leave." Dean felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the analytical calm that took over when he was processing threat assessment. This wasn't abstract sadness or philosophical emptiness. This was concrete danger to something that mattered, to someone who mattered. "How much debt?" he asked, his voice steady despite the surge of protective fury beginning to build. $58,000, June said, the number clearly memorized from hearing it repeated, probably in conversations the adults thought the children weren't listening to. "Rose has been trying to raise it, but nobody wants to help because the developer is really powerful and people are scared of him. And even if she could raise the money, he might not accept it because he wants this building for something else, something that makes more money than a home for kids nobody wants." The last words were said with heartbreaking clarity. June knew exactly how the world saw her and the other children, knew they were considered disposable, inconvenient, less valuable than real estate development, knew their home was being taken not because they'd done anything wrong, but simply because more powerful people wanted the space for something more profitable. "Rose tries to hide how worried she is, but I can tell," June continued, tears now sliding down her cheeks despite her efforts at control. "She thinks we don't notice, but we all know. Marcus heard her crying in the office last week. Sarah and Rebecca have started having nightmares about moving again. And Tommy's too little to understand, but he knows something's wrong and it makes him clingy." "Where would you go?" Dean asked, though he already knew the answer would make him angry. "Back into the system, different homes. They try to keep siblings together, but Rose isn't our actual family, so we wouldn't get to stay together. I'd probably go to a foster home somewhere. Maybe a good one, maybe not. And Rose would have to start over somewhere else, if she could even afford to, and we'd all just be..." June's voice broke completely. "We'd all just be scattered." Dean watched this small girl trying desperately not to fall apart, trying to maintain composure while describing the imminent destruction of the only family she'd known for 3 years. Watched her wipe tears with the sleeve of her thin coat, taking deep breaths to regain control, demonstrating resilience that came from having survived too much already. And something fundamental shifted inside Dean Miller. For 15 years, he'd used his power and resources for control, for expansion, for building an empire that meant nothing. For 15 years, he'd made calculated decisions that enriched his organization while maintaining careful emotional distance from actual human impact. For 15 years, he'd been the mechanical nutcracker checking a watch that didn't tell time, going through motions that had no meaning. But here was something that mattered. Here was a concrete problem that money could solve. Here was genuine threat to genuine good, and Dean had the power to eliminate that threat as easily as making a phone call. "Who's the developer?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that June probably didn't recognize but that men in his organization would have understood immediately. It was the tone that preceded action, that signaled Dean had stopped assessing and started planning. "His name is Whitmore," June replied, not noticing the shift in Dean's demeanor. "Richard Whitmore." Rose says he owns half the buildings on this block, and he wants to knock them down and build luxury condos. She says people like him see neighborhoods as investments instead of homes, and we're just in the way of profit. Richard Whitmore. Dean knew the name, knew the reputation. Mid-level developer, ambitious but not particularly intelligent, the kind of businessman who succeeded through pressure tactics and exploitation rather than actual skill, the kind of man Dean normally had no interest in bothering with because they were beneath his notice. But Whitmore had just made himself Dean's problem by threatening something that mattered. June, Dean said carefully, his mind already racing through options, through leverage points, through the fastest way to eliminate this threat permanently. I want you to know something. This home isn't closing. You're not losing Rose or your family. I'm going to fix this. June looked at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, but had learned through hard experience that adults made promises they couldn't keep. You can't. Rose has tried everything. Whitmore is too powerful. Dean felt something that might have been a smile, except it carried no warmth, only the cold calculation of someone who'd just identified a target. He's not powerful, June. He just thinks he is. There's a significant difference. But the money. The money is irrelevant, Dean interrupted gently. I can write a check for $58,000 right now, and it wouldn't impact me any more than buying a coffee. But that's not how we're going to solve this. Because men like Whitmore don't just go away when you pay them. They come back. They keep pressuring. They keep threatening. So we're not going to pay him, we're going to remove him from the equation entirely. June was staring at him with an expression of confused hope. How? Let me worry about the how, Dean said. You just focus on what's important, enjoying your home, taking care of Rose and your family, and trusting that sometimes the universe sends someone who can actually help. Are you the universe's helper? June asked with the directness only children possessed. Dean thought about the mechanical nutcracker, about standing alone before toy store windows, about 15 years of emptiness and isolation. Thought about purple coats and unconditional kindness and the strange path that had led him from absolute loneliness to sitting on a sagging couch making promises to an 8-year-old he'd met an hour ago. I don't know what I am, he admitted. But I know what I'm going to do. And that's enough. June was quiet for a moment, processing this with the serious consideration she seemed to bring to everything important. Then she did something that destroyed what remained of Dean's carefully maintained emotional distance. She leaned against his shoulder with complete trust, her small body seeking comfort and offering it simultaneously. Thank you, she whispered, for not being too sad anymore, for coming to dinner, for wanting to help. Rose says the universe provides, but I think sometimes the universe just sends the right person at the right time. I think you're the right person, Dean. Dean sat very still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any motion might break this moment of uncomplicated acceptance. A child was trusting him, believing in him, seeing something worth protecting, and choosing him as the protector. He'd been chosen, not feared, not obeyed, not utilized for strategic advantage, but chosen by a small girl in a purple coat who'd seen his sorrow and responded with kindness, and Dean Miller, who'd spent 15 years building walls, felt every defense crumble under the weight of that simple trust. I'll fix this, he said quietly, the words a promise not to June but to himself. I swear to you, June, your home is safe. Your family is safe. You're safe. And for the first time in 15 years, Dean meant every word. Rose found them 20 minutes later. Dean still sitting carefully still while June had dozed off against his shoulder, exhausted from emotional intensity and the comfort of believing someone might actually solve the impossible. Rose stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene with eyes that saw far too much. She told you, Rose said quietly. Not quite a question. About Whitmore, Dean confirmed, his voice low to avoid waking June. About the debt. About January 15th. Rose moved into the room, settling into the worn armchair across from them, with the careful movements of someone carrying weight they couldn't put down. She wasn't supposed to know the details. We try to protect the children from the worst of it, but June notices everything. She's terrified, Dean said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. She's 8 years old and she's terrified of losing the only stable family she's known. That's unacceptable. I agree, Rose replied, steel beneath the exhaustion in her voice, which is why I've been fighting this for 6 months. But fighting Richard Whitmore requires resources I don't have and connections I can't access. He's positioned himself carefully, legally sound, even if morally bankrupt. I've talked to lawyers who say we have no case. I've talked to banks who won't give us loans because this building is already marked for acquisition. I've talked to city officials who mysteriously become unavailable when I mention Whitmore's name. She leaned forward, her expression carrying intensity that matched Dean's. I know who you are, Mr. Miller. I grew up in this city. I know the circles you operate in, the kind of power you wield. And I understand that sitting here with my ward probably represents some kind of anomaly in your normally very controlled existence. Dean met her gaze, seeing no judgment in her eyes despite her clear understanding of his world. It does. June sees the best in people, Rose continued. She has a gift for looking past surfaces to what's underneath. Sometimes that's dangerous. She's too trusting for a world that doesn't always reward trust. But sometimes, she paused, her eyes moving to June's sleeping form. Sometimes she sees what everyone else misses. She saw you were hurting, and she responded the only way she knows how, with kindness. She invited a stranger to dinner, Dean said. I could have been anyone. I could have been dangerous. You are dangerous, Rose corrected calmly. Just not to her. June understands fear, she's lived with it her entire life, and she recognized what you were feeling wasn't threat but loneliness. Sometimes those look similar from the outside, but they're completely different underneath. Dean carefully adjusted his position so June could sleep more comfortably, the paternal gesture feeling foreign but somehow natural. She told me about the crisis, about losing the home, about being separated. I know. I can tell by your face. Rose's expression was impossible to read. And now you're thinking you can fix this. You're already planning how to eliminate Whitmore as a threat, how to secure the building, how to throw money at a problem until it disappears. Because that's what powerful men do, they see problems and they solve them through application of resources and influence. Is that so wrong? Dean asked, hearing defensiveness in his own voice. Not wrong, just incomplete. Rose stood, moving to the window where Christmas lights from neighboring buildings cast colored shadows across her face. Money can solve the immediate crisis, power can eliminate Whitmore, but June and the other children, they need more than financial security. They need stability. They need people who'll be here not just for one crisis but for all of them. They need family, Dean finished quietly. Yes. Rose turned back to face him. So before you ride in like some avenging angel and throw money at our problems, I need to understand something. Is this impulse? A wealthy man having a moment of guilt or Christmas sentimentality that'll fade once you're back in your normal life? Or is this something real? Because June has already lost too many things. If you make her promises you can't keep, if you make her believe she's safe and then disappear once the novelty wears off, that will damage her in ways money can't repair. The words hit Dean with the force of accusation, and he realized Rose was doing exactly what any good guardian would do, protecting her child from potential harm even when that harm wore expensive clothes and made generous offers. She was assessing whether he was threat or ally, whether his intervention would help or ultimately cause more pain. I don't know, Dean admitted, the honesty surprising himself. I don't know what this is. I've spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection because vulnerability is weakness and attachment is liability. I've built my entire existence on maintaining distance, on never caring about anything enough that losing it could hurt me. He looked down at June, sleeping against his shoulder, at the trust implicit in her relaxed posture, at the purple coat still clutched in her small hands. But June decided I mattered anyway. She looked at me, really looked at me, and decided I was worth saving despite having no reason to care. She offered me dinner and family and simple human kindness when I was. He paused, searching for accurate words. When I was standing before a toy store wanting to stop existing because existing felt pointless. Rose's expression softened slightly. She has that effect on people. So, I don't know if this is impulse or something real, Dean continued. I don't know if tomorrow I'll wake up and regret making promises to a child I met 3 hours ago. But I know that right now, in this moment, protecting June and this home feels like the first meaningful thing I've done in 15 years. And I know that Richard Whitmore threatening to tear apart her family makes me angry in ways that have nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with the fact that she trusted me. He met Rose's eyes directly. So I'm going to eliminate Whitmore as a threat. I'm going to secure this building permanently. And then after the crisis is solved, you and I can have a longer conversation about what role I might play in June's life going forward. But right now, she's scared. And I have the power to remove that fear. That seems like sufficient reason to act. Rose studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through doubt and hope and resignation. You understand that once you start down this path, you can't just walk away? That June will remember your promise? That she'll expect you to follow through not just with money but with presence? I understand, Dean said, though he wasn't entirely certain he understood anything beyond the fierce need to protect this small girl who'd offered him unconditional kindness when he deserved none. "Then I won't stop you," Rose said finally. "But I'm holding you accountable. Not for the money is easy, but for the damage you'll do if you make her believe she matters to you and then disappear." "Fair enough." Dean carefully shifted June's weight, then extracted himself from the couch without waking her. Rose immediately moved to take his place, gathering the child into her arms with practiced care. June murmured something unintelligible, then settled against Rose's shoulder with the unconscious trust of someone who'd been held safely thousands of times. The maternal gesture made Dean's chest ache with something he couldn't name. Longing, maybe. Recognition of something he'd never had and never thought he wanted. The simple beauty of being held by someone who'd promised to keep you safe. He pulled out his phone, seeing 17 missed calls and 32 text messages, all from people who needed him for things that suddenly seemed utterly insignificant. "I need to make some calls. Is there somewhere private I can work?" "There's a small office at the back of the building," Rose said. "It's not much, but it has a desk and a door that closes. Turn left at the top of the stairs. Last room on the right." Dean nodded his thanks and moved through the brownstone, navigating past children doing homework and Martha reading a bedtime story to the younger ones. He found the office easily a cramped room with a donated desk, a filing cabinet that looked older than he was, and walls covered with children's artwork and photos documenting years of life in this building. He closed the door, pulled up Richard Whitmore's information on his phone, and felt the familiar cold calculation settle over him. This was territory he understood. This was power being applied to solve concrete problems. This was Dean Miller doing what he did best, identifying threats and eliminating them with ruthless efficiency. He dialed Marcus first, his second-in-command answering on the first ring with barely controlled frustration. "Boss, where the hell have you been? We've got the Brooklyn situation escalating and Chen needs authorization to—" "Handle it," Dean interrupted. "Whatever decisions need to be made, make them. I'm occupied with something else." Silence. Marcus had worked for Dean for 8 years and had never heard his boss defer decisions. "You're occupied." "Yes. And I need information on Richard Whitmore. Developer. Works primarily in the boroughs. Aggressive acquisition tactics. I want everything financial situation. Who he owes money to. Where his loans come from. What properties he controls. Where his vulnerabilities are. I want it in 1 hour." "Whitmore?" Marcus's confusion was audible. "Boss, he's small time. Not worth your attention." "He just became worth my attention," Dean said, his voice carrying the edge that meant questions would not be welcome. 1 hour, Marcus. Everything. You got it." Dean ended the call and stared at the children's artwork covering the walls. Crayon drawings of houses with smoke coming from chimneys, families holding hands under sunny skies, Christmas trees and presents and smiling faces, the innocent optimism of children who still believed the world could be kind if you just tried hard enough. June's artwork was among them. He recognized her particular style, the way she drew people with exaggerated smiles and hearts incorporated into the backgrounds. One drawing showed a woman labeled Rose, surrounded by multiple stick figures labeled with children's names. In the corner, slightly separated, was a single figure with a purple hat. Under it, in careful child's writing, "June's family. We are safe here. We are safe here." Past tense, after January 15th if Dean didn't act. He pulled up his contacts, began making calls to people who owed him favors, people who specialized in solving problems, people who could make Richard Whitmore's aggressive acquisition tactics feel very unwise very quickly. Each call was brief, professional, and carried the weight of Dean's reputation. When Dean Miller called in a favor, you delivered. By the time Marcus called back with the comprehensive background report on Whitmore, Dean had already laid groundwork that would make the developer's life extraordinarily complicated. By the time he'd reviewed the information, noting with cold satisfaction that Whitmore's financial situation was far more precarious than his aggressive behavior suggested, Dean had identified 17 different pressure points that could be exploited. This wasn't going to take money. This was going to take what Dean did best, applying power with surgical precision to make the impossible inevitable. He made 3 more calls, each one shorter than the last, each one setting pieces in motion that would converge on Richard Whitmore like a carefully orchestrated storm. Then he sat back in the donated office chair, staring at June's drawing, and understood something fundamental about himself. He'd spent 15 years building an empire for no reason other than proving he could. He'd accumulated power without purpose, wealth without meaning, success without satisfaction. He'd been the mechanical nutcracker checking a watch that didn't tell time, going through motions that led nowhere. But tonight, he'd use that power for something that actually mattered, for someone who actually mattered, for protecting rather than just controlling, for building rather than just acquiring. And it felt right in ways that 15 years of success never had. He pulled out his personal checkbook, something he rarely used because transactions that required physical checks were usually handled by accountants, and wrote one for $60,000, made it out to Rose Abbott for building maintenance and security. Dated it, signed it. Not because the money was necessary. Dean was about to eliminate Whitmore entirely, which would solve the immediate crisis without financial transaction. But because Rose had been carrying this burden for 6 months and deserved the security of knowing it was handled. Because June was terrified and deserved immediate relief. Because sometimes the right thing to do was eliminate the immediate fear before solving the underlying problem. He left the office, found Rose in the kitchen cleaning up the last of the dinner dishes. The children were mostly settled for the evening, sounds of bath time and bedtime stories filtering from upstairs. "It's handled," Dean said without preamble. Rose turned, dish towel in hand, her expression skeptical. "You've been in the office for 40 minutes. How is anything handled?" Dean placed the check on the counter between them. "This covers your debt with $2,000 extra for maintenance, but you won't need to cash it because by tomorrow morning, Richard Whitmore will have far more pressing concerns than a brownstone in this neighborhood. I've made calls, applied pressure to people who apply pressure to him. By the time I'm done, he'll be so busy trying to save his own financial situation that this building will be the last thing on his mind." "That fast?" Rose's voice held disbelief. "That's what power is for," Dean replied. "Most people use it wrong, for accumulation instead of application, for building instead of protecting. But used correctly, power is just the ability to make things happen, and I'm making this happen." Rose picked up the check, staring at the amount with eyes that were suddenly wet. "I can't accept this." "You can and you will," Dean said firmly. "Consider it payment for dinner. Best meal I've had in years. 60,000 seems appropriate for the value received." "That's insane. That's perspective." Dean moved to the doorway, then paused. "June's drawing in your office, the one with your family and her note about being safe. She drew that in past tense like she was already mourning what she expected to lose. Children shouldn't have to grieve their safety before they've actually lost it. So I'm making sure she doesn't have to." Rose was openly crying now, tears sliding down her face while she still held the check like she couldn't quite process what was happening. "Why? You don't know us. June invited you to dinner 3 hours ago. Why would you do this for strangers?" Dean thought about the toy store, about mechanical nutcrackers, about 15 years of standing alone before windows, wanting something he couldn't name. Thought about purple coats and unconditional kindness and the strange path that had led him from absolute isolation to standing in this kitchen making promises to protect people who'd done nothing but see his sorrow and offer him soup. "Because June decided I mattered," he said simply. "And nobody's done that in a very long time. So I'm choosing to matter. For her, for this family, for something real instead of just more accumulation of meaningless power." He turned to leave, then stopped. "I'll be back tomorrow. To confirm Whitmore's been neutralized. To make sure you and June understand you're safe. And then..." He paused, uncertain how to finish that sentence. Uncertain what came after the crisis was solved and the immediate threat was eliminated. "And then we'll see," Rose finished gently. "We'll see what you choose beyond the initial gesture. We'll see if this is one moment of goodness or the beginning of something more. We'll see if you meant what you told June about fixing things." "I meant it," Dean said with absolute certainty. "Then tomorrow," Rose agreed. "Come back tomorrow." Dean left the group home and walked through snowy streets back to where his car was still parked by the toy store. The mechanical nutcracker was still checking its eternal watch, the porcelain children still skating their endless circles. But Dean looked at them differently now. Not as mirrors of his own meaningless existence, but as reminders of what he'd escaped. He wasn't trapped in a loop anymore. He'd been chosen, been given purpose, been offered a chance to matter to someone who didn't fear him or need him for strategic advantage, but simply believed he deserved kindness. And Dean Miller, who'd spent 15 years building an empire that meant nothing, had just discovered what actually mattered. A small girl in a purple coat, a shabby brownstone full of chosen family, and the fierce, overwhelming need to protect both from anyone who would dare threaten them. He got in his car, pulled up Richard Whitmore's information one more time, and smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with the cold calculation of someone who'd just identified prey. Tomorrow, Whitmore would learn what happened when you threatened something that Dean Miller had decided to protect, and Dean would make sure the lesson was permanent. Richard Whitmore's office was exactly what Dean expected. Modern furniture with no personality, generic corporate art on walls painted safe neutral gray, floor-to-ceiling windows that projected success while revealing nothing. It was the office of someone who'd read articles about power projection but didn't actually understand how power worked. Dean had arrived without appointment, walking past a receptionist's weak protests with the confidence of someone accustomed to access being granted rather than earned. He entered Whitmore's personal office at 9:17 a.m., finding the developer on a phone call that ended abruptly when he saw who'd just invaded his space. "Mr. Miller," Whitmore said, standing quickly, his surprise evident but professionally masked. "This is unexpected. I don't believe we have a meeting scheduled." "We don't," Dean agreed, settling into the chair across from Whitmore's desk without invitation. "But we need to have a conversation. About a brownstone you've been pressuring. About debts you've been collecting. About plans you're going to abandon." Whitmore's expression cycled through confusion, calculation, then landed on careful neutrality. He was smart enough to recognize threat even when it wore expensive clothing and spoke with calm certainty. "I'm not sure I follow." "The group home on Morrison Street," Dean clarified. "Rose Abbott's building. You've been applying pressure for 6 months, using debt as leverage, planning to acquire the property for luxury condo development. That's ending today. With respect, Mr. Miller, I don't see how that concerns you." Whitmore had recovered his composure, settling back into his chair with the false confidence of someone who didn't yet understand how much danger he was in. "That property represents a legitimate business opportunity. I've followed all legal requirements. If the current owner can't meet her financial obligations, that's unfortunate but not my problem." "You're right," Dean agreed pleasantly. "It was her problem. Past tense. As of this morning, Rose Abbott's debt is cleared. The building is secured. Your opportunity to acquire that property has evaporated." Whitmore's professional mask slipped slightly. "You paid her debt." "I solved her problem," Dean corrected. "How I solved it is irrelevant. What matters is that the pressure you've been applying has been eliminated. The building isn't available. Your development plans need to exclude that property. One building out of an entire block development isn't significant," Whitmore said, though something in his voice suggested he was recalculating. "We can work around it. Adjust the design. The project continues regardless." "No," Dean said simply. "The project doesn't continue, because you don't have financing anymore." The color drained from Whitmore's face. "What are you talking about?" "Your primary lender received a call this morning from someone whose opinion they value considerably. That someone expressed concerns about your risk profile, about your aggressive acquisition tactics, about the long-term viability of your development plans. Your line of credit has been suspended pending review, which means no capital for land acquisition, no funding for construction, no resources to continue pressuring property owners." Dean leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm despite the devastation he was describing. "Additionally, the permits you've been waiting on for the Morrison Street development have been flagged for additional environmental review. That process typically takes 9 to 12 months, during which you'll be carrying debt on properties you've already acquired without any ability to develop them, properties that are rapidly depreciating in value without corresponding income." Whitmore was genuinely pale now, his hands gripping his desk with white-knuckle intensity. "You can't, that's not how did you—" "I made phone calls," Dean said, "to people who owe me favors, to people who understand that when I ask for something, delivering is in their best interest, to people who found it very easy to identify vulnerabilities in your financial situation and apply pressure accordingly." He stood, buttoning his coat with casual precision. "You have 2 choices, Whitmore. First option, you fight this. You try to recover your financing, you push on the permits, you continue aggressive tactics, in which case I'll continue applying pressure until your entire organization collapses. I'll systematically identify and exploit every weakness in your business model until you're not just unable to develop that block, but unable to develop anything, anywhere." Dean moved to the door, then turned back. "Second option, you accept that the Morrison Street project is dead. You focus on salvaging what you can from your remaining holdings. You leave Rose Abbott and her building alone permanently, and I stop making your life exponentially more difficult." "This is extortion," Whitmore managed, his voice carrying outrage that couldn't quite overcome the fear underneath. "This is business," Dean corrected. "This is what happens when you threaten something I've decided to protect. You made a strategic error, Whitmore. You assumed that a group home full of children had no one powerful enough to defend it. You were wrong. They have me. And I'm very, very good at eliminating threats to things I care about. I followed the law, Whitmore protested. Everything I did was legal. Legal and wise are different things, Dean said. Legal means you won't face prosecution. Wise means you don't make enemies capable of destroying you through entirely legal channels. You managed legal but failed at wise. That's a expensive lesson to learn. He opened the door, then paused for final emphasis. You have until end of business today to decide. Continue fighting and I'll systematically dismantle everything you've built. Or accept defeat and I'll stop making calls. Choose carefully. Dean left without waiting for response, walking past the receptionist with the same confident access he'd entered with. He was in his car and pulling away from the building before Whitmore had time to process what had just happened, before the developer could formulate any kind of response beyond shocked recognition that he'd been comprehensively outmaneuvered. The drive back to Morrison Street took 12 minutes through morning traffic. Dean spent it reviewing the overnight reports from Marcus, confirming that every piece he'd set in motion was functioning exactly as designed. Whitmore's financing was genuinely suspended. The permits were actually flagged. The pressure was real, comprehensive, and would only increase if the developer was stupid enough to keep fighting. But Dean didn't think Whitmore would fight. He'd seen the fear in the developer's eyes, the recognition of being completely outmatched. Whitmore was a small-time operator who'd gotten lucky on a few deals and overestimated his own capabilities. When faced with someone who actually understood how to apply power with surgical precision, he'd fold. Not because he was weak, but because he was smart enough to recognize when he'd lost. Dean parked outside the group home at 9:51 a.m., noting the Christmas decorations that looked slightly less worn in morning light, the handmade wreath that represented care invested by people with limited resources. He knocked rather than entering, waiting for invitation rather than assuming access. Rose opened the door, her expression cycling through surprise and relief when she saw him. You came back. I said I would. Dean stepped inside when she moved to allow it. Is June awake? She's having breakfast with the other children. Do you want? I want to tell her she's safe, Dean interrupted gently. I want her to know the crisis is solved. I want her to stop being terrified of January 15th. Rose studied him with those perceptive eyes that saw too much. What did you do? I had a conversation with Richard Whitmore. A very productive conversation. One that concluded with him understanding that continuing to pressure this building would be catastrophically unwise. That's it? One conversation? One conversation backed by systematic elimination of his strategic options, Dean clarified. His financing is suspended. His permits are delayed. His entire development plan has been compromised. By the time I was done, continuing to pursue this building was the least attractive option available to him. Rose led him to the dining room, where organized breakfast chaos was in full swing. Children eating cereal and toast with varying degrees of table manners. Martha refilling juice cups, the sounds of morning routine that felt impossibly warm and normal. June looked up when Dean entered, her face transforming with delight. Dean, you came back. She was out of her chair and running toward him before he could respond, wrapping small arms around his waist with the uncomplicated affection of a child who'd decided he was safe. Rose said you might come by today, but I wasn't sure, and I was hoping because you promised to fix things and I wanted to believe you, but sometimes promises don't. June, Dean said gently, kneeling so they were at eye level. Slow down. Breathe. She took a dramatic breath, her eyes never leaving his face. Okay, breathing. You're here. You came back. I came back to tell you something important. Dean was aware of the entire room watching children paused mid-bite. Martha's hand frozen over a juice cup. Rose standing in the doorway with her arms crossed but her expression open. The home isn't closing. The crisis is solved. You're safe. June stared at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, but had learned to be cautious. Really? Like really? Not just maybe or hopefully, but actually safe? Actually safe, Dean confirmed. Richard Whitmore will not be acquiring this building. The debt has been paid. The pressure has been eliminated. January 15th is just another day now. You're not losing Rose or your family or this home. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then June threw herself at Dean with enough force that he had to catch her to avoid falling backward, her small body shaking with sobs that sounded like relief mixed with residual fear mixed with joy that had been held back too long. Dean held her carefully, aware that this was probably the first time she'd let herself actually cry about the crisis, that she'd been being brave for the other children and now could finally fall apart because someone had made it safe to do so. Around them, The other children processed the news with varying reactions. The younger ones cheered, not fully understanding but recognizing that the adults were happy. The older ones, Marcus especially, watched with careful skepticism, waiting to see if this was real or another false hope. Rose had tears sliding down her face but was smiling through them, her hand pressed to her mouth like she was holding back words. "You fixed it," June said eventually, pulling back enough to look at Dean's face while still holding onto him like he might disappear. "You really fixed it. We get to stay." "You get to stay," Dean confirmed. "All of you. This is your home. Nobody's taking it away." June's arms tightened around him again, and Dean felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was what mattering felt like. This was the purpose he'd been searching for while standing before toy store windows. Not power for its own sake or wealth without meaning, but the simple, profound satisfaction of having protected something that deserved protection. "Thank you," June whispered against his coat. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for making us safe. Thank you for foreseeing me yesterday, for letting me invite you, for being here." Dean held this small girl who'd offered him unconditional kindness when he'd deserved none, who'd looked at his sorrow and responded with compassion, who'd accidentally given him a reason to use 15 years of accumulated power for something that actually mattered. "Thank you for the invitation," he said quietly. "For the soup. For the family. For reminding me what actually matters." Rose moved closer, kneeling beside them. "June, sweetheart, give Dean some space to breathe." June loosened her grip reluctantly, wiping tears with her sleeve. "Sorry, I was so scared. And now I'm not scared anymore." That's a big change." "It's a very big change," Rose agreed, her eyes meeting Dean's with an expression that held gratitude and something else, something that looked like the beginning of trust. "Mr. Miller, we need to talk. About what comes next. About—" "Dean," he interrupted gently. "Just Dean. Mr. Miller is for business associates, and people I don't particularly like. You can call me Dean." "Dean, then," Rose agreed. "We need to talk about next steps. About what your involvement looks like going forward. About whether I'm planning to disappear now that the crisis is solved." Dean finished for her, understanding the concern beneath her words. "About whether I made promises to June that I'll actually keep, or if this was impulse that will fade." Rose's expression confirmed he'd understood correctly. "Yes, that." Dean looked at June, at her hopeful eyes and her purple coat and the way she was still holding onto his hand like he might disappear if she let go. Looked at Rose and her cautious optimism and her fierce protectiveness of her chosen family. Looked around the dining room at children eating breakfast in a home that was truly safe now because he'd made it so. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted honestly. "I don't know what long-term involvement looks like or how a man like me fits into a life like yours. But I know I'm not disappearing. I know I meant what I told June last night about fixing things. And I know—" He paused, searching for words adequate to describe something he didn't fully understand himself. "I know that standing in this dining room feels more real than 15 years of building an empire. So whatever comes next, I'm not running from it." Rose searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, then we'll figure it out. Together. One day at a time." "One day at a time," Dean agreed. June was beaming now, her fear replaced with uncomplicated joy. "Does this mean you'll come back? For dinner or visits or just to say hi?" "Yes," Dean said, the commitment feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. "I'll come back. He stopped, realizing what he was about to offer, understanding the weight of it but unable to pull back. "I'll be here, June. However you need me to be, for as long as you want me around." June's smile could have lit the entire city. "Forever? Can you be here forever?" Dean thought about mechanical nutcrackers and toy store windows and 15 years of searching for something he couldn't name. Thought about purple coats and unconditional kindness and a small girl who decided he mattered. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can do forever." And in a shabby brownstone full of chosen family, Dean Miller made a promise that changed everything. Not because it was strategic, not because it advanced his position or expanded his empire, but because it was right and real, and the first meaningful thing he'd done in 15 years. June hugged him again, and Dean held her carefully, understanding that he'd just been given something infinitely more valuable than all his accumulated wealth and power. He'd been given a second chance at mattering, and he wasn't going to waste it. Dean returned to his penthouse that evening after spending most of the day at the group home helping with minor repairs, playing board games with children who treated him with increasing familiarity, having lengthy conversations with Rose about finances and stability and what sustainable support actually meant. By the time he left at 8 p.m., June had insisted on a proper goodbye that included at least 3 hugs and a promise that he'd be back tomorrow. The penthouse felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt oppressive. The expensive furniture that projected success now looked sterile. The city views that used to provide satisfaction now just reminded him that he was up here alone while warmth and connection existed elsewhere, in a shabby brownstone with donated furniture and handmade Christmas decorations. Dean stood in his living room, 2,400 square feet of luxury that no one but him ever occupied, and understood with devastating clarity that he'd been living in a prison of his own design. Had mistaken isolation for independence, emptiness for freedom, control for security. His phone buzzed with messages from Marcus' routine business that had somehow continued despite Dean's unprecedented absence from the organization's daily operations. Territory disputes that needed arbitration, financial decisions that required his approval, strategic planning for the next quarter's operations, the empire running itself with characteristic efficiency, barely noticing that its leader had been elsewhere investing his attention in something that had nothing to do with business. Dean ignored all of it, poured a scotch he didn't want, stood by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a city he controlled but didn't actually touch. He thought about June asking if he could be there forever, about the casual way she'd said it, like forever was a reasonable thing to request, like his presence was valuable enough to want permanently, about how he'd agreed without hesitation, making promises that should have terrified him but somehow felt like the most honest thing he'd ever done. Forever meant commitment. Meant showing up not just when it was convenient or novel, but when it was hard or boring, or when the initial satisfaction of solving the crisis had faded into mundane routine. Forever meant choosing to be present despite every instinct that screamed vulnerability was dangerous and connection was liability. Dean had built his entire adult life on avoiding exactly that kind of commitment, on maintaining distance, on ensuring he could walk away from anything without loss because nothing mattered enough to risk the pain of losing it. But June mattered. The group home mattered. The strange, unexpected family he'd been accidentally adopted into mattered in ways that 15 years of empire building had never approached, and that terrified him more than any business rival or territorial dispute ever could. His phone rang, not Marcus this time, but Rose. Dean answered immediately, concern overriding hesitation. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Rose assured him, her voice warm despite the late hour. "June wanted me to call. She's worried you might change your mind overnight, that you'll wake up tomorrow and decide this was all too complicated and disappear. I told her you wouldn't do that, but she needs to hear it from you." Dean heard shuffling on the other end, then June's voice, small and worried. "Dean, are you still going to come back tomorrow?" "Yes," Dean said immediately. "I promised, June. I keep my promises." "Even when it's hard? Even when it stops being exciting and just becomes normal?" June's voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned that adults' commitments often had expiration dates, because Rose says that's when people usually leave, when things stop being new and special and become just regular life. Dean sat down on his sterile leather couch, staring at artwork he'd purchased because interior designers said it projected sophistication, feeling the full weight of what June was really asking. She wasn't just asking if he'd come back tomorrow. She was asking if he'd stay after the novelty wore off, if he'd be present for boring Tuesdays and difficult moments, and all the mundane reality of actually being in someone's life rather than just making grand gestures. "June, I can't promise that every day will be exciting," Dean said carefully. "I can't promise I'll always know what to do, or that I won't make mistakes, but I can promise that I'm not leaving. Not tomorrow. Not when it stops being new. Not when it becomes just regular life. Because regular life with you and Rose and your family is better than anything I've had in 15 years of being alone." "Really?" June's voice was tiny, hopeful, still cautious. "You really mean that?" "Really," Dean confirmed. "June, do you remember yesterday when you found me by the toy store? When you saw I was sad?" "Yes. You saved me," Dean said quietly. "You didn't know it and you probably won't understand it for years, but you saved me from a life that looked successful, but felt empty. And now I'm choosing to stay saved, which means being here, with you, for as long as you'll have me." Silence. Then, "Forever?" "Forever," Dean agreed, feeling the word settle into his chest like a vow. "I'm not going anywhere, June. You're stuck with me." June's giggle was relieved and happy. "Good, because I like having you around. You're sad sometimes, but you're also kind and you keep promises and you make Rose smile more. That's important. Go to sleep, sweetheart." Rose's voice came through, gentle but firm. Dean will be here tomorrow. And the day after. You need rest. Okay. Good night, Dean. Thank you for staying. Good night, June. The line switched back to Rose. Thank you for that. She's been holding it together all day, but the fear was building underneath. Needed confirmation before she could sleep. She shouldn't have to be afraid, Dean said, hearing the edge in his own voice. She shouldn't have to worry that adults will disappear on her. No, she shouldn't, Rose agreed. But that's been her experience. So patience and consistency will matter more than grand gestures. She needs to see you show up on boring days. She needs to watch you choose to be present when it's hard. That's how trust gets built. I understand. Do you? Rose's voice was gentle but challenging. Because from where I'm sitting, you've just committed to something that will fundamentally change your life. You're not just helping us anymore, you're becoming part of this family. That means showing up for school plays and homework help, and middle-of-the-night stomach bugs. That means being here when June has nightmares, or Marcus acts out, or one of the younger kids needs patience you don't feel you have that day. Are you ready for that? Dean thought about his penthouse, about the silence and the isolation, and the careful control he'd maintained for 15 years. Thought about walking away from all of it, from the emptiness disguised as freedom, from the prison he'd built and called a palace. No, he admitted. I'm probably not ready. I have no experience with family or children or being present for anything beyond business. I'll probably make mistakes, probably disappoint her sometimes, probably fail at things that seem easy to people who grew up in functional families. He paused, staring at his reflection in the darkened windows. But I want to learn. I want to figure out how to be present, instead of just powerful. I want to matter to June in ways that go beyond solving one crisis. He stopped, searching for words adequate to describe something he'd never wanted before. I want to be the person she thinks I am, the person who keeps promises and shows up and chooses to stay even when it's hard. I don't know how to be that person yet, but I want to learn. That's enough, Rose said quietly. Wanting to learn, being willing to try, that's all any of us can offer. None of us are perfect, Dean. We're just doing our best and hoping it's sufficient. June deserves better than my best, Dean said. June deserves exactly what you're offering, genuine commitment from someone who wants to be here. That matters more than competence or experience. Children can sense the difference between someone who's present because they want to be and someone who's present because they feel obligated. June knows you're choosing this. That's why she's allowing herself to hope. Dean wanted to say something else, to express the confusion and fear and overwhelming rightness of what was happening. But words failed him. He'd spent 15 years talking about business and strategy and power dynamics. He had no vocabulary for what he was feeling now. This strange mixture of terror and certainty. This sense of having found something he didn't know he'd lost. This recognition that protecting June mattered more than protecting his carefully maintained emotional distance. Tomorrow, Rose said, understanding his silence. Come by around dinner time. We're having spaghetti. Nothing fancy, but the kids love it, and June specifically requested you be here for it. I'll be there, Dean promised. Good. And Dean? Thank you. For keeping your promise. For taking June's invitation seriously. For being willing to learn. That matters more than you probably realize. After the call ended, Dean sat in his silent penthouse and understood that he'd reached a decision point. He could continue maintaining his isolated existence, showing up at the group home occasionally as a generous benefactor but keeping careful distance between his real life and this unexpected family. Or he could commit fully, accepting the vulnerability and messiness and profound discomfort of actually letting people matter. The safe choice was maintaining distance. The smart choice was protecting himself from potential loss by ensuring he never invested enough to be hurt. But Dean had spent 15 years making safe, smart choices that had led him to standing before toy store windows, wishing he could stop existing. So maybe it was time to make the dangerous, foolish choice instead. The choice to stay, to commit, to accept that loving people meant accepting the risk of losing them, but that the alternative, refusing to love anyone to avoid the pain of loss, wasn't protection. It was just another kind of dying. Dean pulled out his laptop and began drafting changes to his life that would have seemed impossible 48 hours ago. Adjusting his schedule to prioritize presence over business. Identifying responsibilities he could delegate to Marcus and other trusted associates. Creating space in his carefully controlled existence for something unpredictable and messy, and infinitely more valuable than any strategic advantage. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. The city had quieted to its late-night rhythm. The scotch he'd poured hours ago sat untouched on the table beside him, and Dean Miller, who'd built an empire on emotional distance, made plans to dismantle that empire piece by piece so he could actually live instead of just surviving. He'd tell Marcus tomorrow, would delegate operational control while maintaining strategic oversight, would step back from day-to-day management so he could step forward into something that actually mattered. His phone showed a text from June, sent hours ago, but only now noticed. "Good night, Dean. See you tomorrow. Love you. Love you." 2 words, casual, simple, devastating in their implications. A child had decided to love him, had chosen to invest her vulnerable heart in someone who'd shown up 36 hours ago, had risked the pain of eventual loss because the alternative holding back apparently seemed worse to her than taking the chance. Dean stared at those 2 words for a long time, feeling something crack and rebuild simultaneously in his chest. He'd spent 15 years earning fear and respect and obedience, had accumulated power that made grown men nervous and rival organizations cautious, but he'd never earned love, had never inspired anyone to offer him the vulnerable, unconditional affection June had just expressed so casually. He typed a response, deleting and rewriting it 3 times before settling on something honest. "Love you too, June. Sleep well. See you tomorrow." Then he sat in his silent penthouse and cried for the first time in 15 years. Not from sadness or grief, or the crushing emptiness that had driven him to toy store windows, but from overwhelming relief that he'd been found, been seen, been chosen by a small girl in a purple coat who decided he was worth saving. Tomorrow he'd go back, would show up for spaghetti dinner, would prove through presence, rather than grand gestures, that his commitment was real. Tomorrow he'd start learning how to be the person June believed him to be. But tonight he sat alone one more time, saying goodbye to the isolation he'd mistaken for independence, mourning the wasted years while simultaneously feeling grateful they'd led him to Morrison Street and a toy store window and a small hand tugging on his coat. Everything was changing. Everything was terrifying. Everything was exactly right. And Dean Miller, who'd spent 15 years building walls, finally understood what those walls had been keeping out wasn't threat or danger or vulnerability. It was love. Simple, unconditional, transformative love. The kind offered by children who still believed adults could be trusted. The kind that saved you if you were brave enough to accept it. The kind Dean was finally, desperately ready to receive. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Dean had never experienced. Days structured not around business needs but around June's schedule. Dinners at the group home becoming routine rather than novelty, his presence shifting from remarkable to expected. He learned the names of all the children, their individual quirks, their fears and hopes, and the small traumas they'd survived to end up in Rose's care. He helped with homework and played endless rounds of board games and learned to read bedtime stories with the dramatic voices that made the younger children giggle. He also learned about Rose, about how she'd lost her own daughter 15 years ago, how that grief had transformed into purpose, how she'd started taking in foster children as a way of keeping her daughter's memory alive through caring for children who needed exactly what her own child could no longer receive. She'd built this home from pain, transforming loss into sanctuary, proving that the best response to suffering was reducing suffering for others. Dean understood that better now. Understood that power could heal instead of just intimidate, that resources could build instead of just accumulate, that presence mattered more than presence. June had become a constant at his side during group home activities, texting him throughout her school day with observations and questions, falling asleep against his shoulder during movie nights with trust that destroyed him every time. She'd stopped asking if he was coming back and started assuming his presence, her fear gradually replaced by security that came from consistent follow-through. But Dean knew there was still something incomplete about their arrangement. He was present, yes. But legally, he was just a friend, a benefactor, someone who had no formal standing in June's life. If something happened to Rose, if the system intervened, Dean would have no claim, no right to ensure June's continued security. That awareness became unbearable on January 14th, exactly 1 day before what would have been the catastrophic deadline if Dean hadn't intervened. He and Rose were cleaning up after dinner, while the children did homework in various corners of the brownstone. June was at the kitchen table, working on a math worksheet with determined concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly in the way it did when she was thinking hard. "I need to talk to you," Dean said quietly to Rose. "Privately, if you have time." Rose looked at him with those perceptive eyes that always saw more than he revealed. "Martha can supervise bedtime. Let's talk in the office." They settled into the cramped space, Rose behind the donated desk and Dean in the uncomfortable chair June had drawn pictures on years ago. He'd come prepared, had documents in his briefcase, had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his mind. But now, facing Rose's calm attention. All his prepared words felt inadequate. "I want to adopt June," he said, abandoning eloquence for directness. "Formally, legally, I want to become her father in every way that matters." Rose's expression didn't change, but Dean saw her hands tighten on the desk. "That's a significant commitment." "I know. I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks. Consulted lawyers, researched the process, understood the implications. As a single man with my particular background, adoption will be complicated, but not impossible, especially if you're willing to support the application." "Why?" Rose asked simply. "Because I love her," Dean said. "Because she saved me from an existence that looked successful but felt meaningless. Because when I think about my life going forward, she's in every mental picture. Because the idea of her being unsafe or insecure makes me irrationally angry in ways that have nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with protective instinct I didn't know I possessed." He leaned forward, intensity breaking through his usual control. "Because yesterday I was reviewing my estate planning and realized that if I died tomorrow, June would receive nothing, would have no legal claim on me, would be just another child in the system I happened to help for a few weeks. And that's unacceptable. She's my daughter in every way except the legal paperwork. I want to fix that." "You've known her 3 weeks, Rose pointed out, though her tone suggested she was testing rather than objecting. "I've known her forever," Dean corrected. "Just didn't meet her until 3 weeks ago. He stopped, searching for words adequate to express something he barely understood himself. "She's the reason I'm still here, Rose. Not just in this building, but in existence. I was dying slowly for 15 years, just hadn't admitted it yet, and June looked at me and decided I was worth saving. So now I'm choosing to save her back, to give her the security and protection and unconditional love she's been offering me since the moment we met." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded on the desk, her expression cycling through consideration and concern. "June loves you. That's obvious to anyone watching. She lights up when you arrive, talks about you constantly when you're gone, has already decided you're permanent. But Dean," she paused, choosing words carefully, "children have been hurt by adults who promised permanence before. Adults who seemed committed until life got hard or complicated, or the child stopped being convenient. I need to know this isn't impulse. I need to know you've thought through what you're actually committing to." "I have," Dean said. "I've thought about nothing else. Thought about how my life changes if I'm legally responsible for a child. Thought about school functions and parent-teacher conferences and teaching her to drive in 10 years. Thought about teenage rebellion and college tuition and walking her down the aisle at her wedding. Thought about all of it, Rose. And none of it scares me as much as the alternative, her growing up without legal confirmation that she belongs to me." "She's 8, Rose said gently. "In 10 years she'll be an adult. You'd be committing to raising her through what will likely be very difficult preteen and teenage years. She has trauma from her early childhood. She'll have moments where she tests boundaries, where she's afraid to trust your commitment, where she pushes you away because that feels safer than risking the pain of you leaving. Are you prepared for that?" Dean thought about 15 years of building emotional walls, about the isolation he'd mistaken for strength, about the profound emptiness that had driven him to toy store windows. "I've spent my entire adult life pushing people away before they could push me away first. I understand that defensive mechanism intimately, so yes, I'm prepared for June to test me. I'm prepared to prove through consistent presence that I'm not leaving no matter how hard she pushes. I'm prepared to," his voice cracked slightly, "to be the father she deserves instead of the one I had." Rose's expression softened. "Your father left when I was 6. Came back occasionally when he needed money or wanted to pretend he cared. Disappeared permanently when I was 12. Taught me that counting on adults was dangerous, that trust was liability, that the only person you could rely on was yourself. I became successful by internalizing those lessons, built an empire by refusing to need anyone." Dean met Rose's eyes directly. "But those lessons were wrong. They kept me safe, but they kept me alone. And June is teaching me different lessons, that needing people isn't weakness, that trust isn't liability, that love is worth the risk of loss. So I want to give her what I never had: a father who stays, who shows up, who chooses her every single day even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." "You've really thought this through," Rose said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I've thought about nothing else," Dean confirmed. "Rose, I know this is fast. I know 3 weeks seems insufficient to make a decision this profound. But I also know with more certainty than I've known anything in 15 years that June is mine and I'm hers, that we found each other at exactly the right moment, that she offered me family when I'd forgotten what family felt like. And now I want to offer her the same permanence, security, unconditional belonging. What about your business? Rose asked. Your organization operates in complicated spaces. How does raising a child fit with that kind of life? I've been delegating operational control, Dean said. Marcus and my other trusted associates can handle day-to-day management. I'll maintain strategic oversight, but I'm stepping back from anything that requires constant availability or puts me in situations where June's security might be compromised. He paused, recognizing the weight of what he was saying. I'm choosing her over the Empire, choosing presence over power, choosing to actually live instead of just surviving. Rose studied him for another long moment, her expression impossible to read. Then, June will be thrilled. She's been asking when you're going to be her real dad. I've told her that you already are in all the ways that matter, but she wants the official version. Wants to be able to say, my dad, instead of my friend Dean. Dean felt something in his chest expand. She's been asking? Constantly. She's written it in her journal, drawn pictures of it, told the other children about it with absolute certainty, despite me cautioning her to be patient. In her mind, you're already her father. The legal paperwork is just confirmation of what's already true. Then let's make it official, Dean said. Let's give her that confirmation. Let's make sure she knows legally, permanently, irrevocably, that she belongs to someone who will never leave. Rose opened a drawer, pulled out papers Dean recognized as adoption forms. I figured you'd get here eventually. Already started the process on my end. As her current guardian, I can expedite things if I support the adoption. Your lawyer will need to file formal petitions. There'll be home visits and background checks. But Rose Abbott's recommendation carries weight with family court judges I've worked with for 15 years. Dean stared at the papers, at the possibility of permanence laid out in official forms. You already knew I was going to ask. I've been watching you for 3 weeks, Rose said with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Watching you show up every day, watching you learn how to be present, watching you choose June over business obligations repeatedly, watching you become exactly what she needs, someone consistent, someone protective, someone who sees her and chooses her anyway. You were always going to get here, Dean. I just needed to confirm you understood what you were committing to. I understand, Dean said. I'm committing to forever, to showing up, to being her father in every way that matters, to loving her even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Then let's make it official, Rose agreed. Let's give June the father she's already decided you are. They spent the next hour reviewing paperwork, discussing timelines, mapping the legal process that would transform Dean from friend to father. It would take months to finalize background checks and home visits and court appearances, but Rose's support made approval likely rather than merely possible. When they finished, Dean felt something he'd never experienced, not the satisfaction of a successful business deal, but the profound rightness of having formalized a commitment to something that actually mattered. He was going to be June's father. Legally, permanently, irrevocably. Should we tell her? Dean asked. Or wait until the paperwork progresses? We tell her now, Rose said firmly. She's been waiting for this confirmation. Making her wait longer when you've already decided seems cruel. They found June exactly where they'd left her, still working on math with determined concentration that dissolved into pure joy, when Rose said, June, honey, Dean has something to ask you. June looked up, her eyes moving between Rose and Dean, with the intensity of someone who sensed something important was happening. What? Dean knelt so they were eye level, his heart pounding with nervousness that had nothing to do with business negotiations and everything to do with the small girl whose answer would define his future. June, I love you. You know that, right? I know, June said seriously. I love you too. Good. Because I want to ask you something important, something that will change both our lives if you say yes. Dean took a breath, steadying himself. I want to adopt you. I want to be your real dad, not just your friend who shows up for dinner. I want it to be official and legal that you're mine and I'm yours forever. Would you want that? June stared at him with eyes that were suddenly filled with tears. Really? Like really, really? You want to be my actual dad? More than anything, Dean said honestly. Even though I'm not perfect? Even though I get scared sometimes and I have nightmares and I'm bad at math and I talk too much? Especially because of all those things, Dean said, pulling her close. You're perfect exactly as you are, June. And I want to be your dad through all of it, the nightmares and the math struggles and the talking too much that I actually love. All of it. Forever. June's arms wrapped around his neck with desperate strength. Yes, 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 yes. I want you to be my dad. I've been wanting it forever, but I was scared to ask because what if you said no and then everything would be weird? Dean held her while she cried into his shoulder relief and joy, and the release of fear she'd been carrying. Held her until the tears subsided and she pulled back with a smile that could have powered the entire city. When? When does it become official? It takes a few months, Rose explained gently. There's paperwork and court visits and lots of boring adult stuff. But Dean's starting the process now. So maybe by spring you'll have officially what you already have emotionally, a dad who's committed to you permanently. Spring, June repeated, like she was savoring the word. By spring I'll have a dad. An actual dad. Dean will be my dad. She looked at Dean with such profound happiness it made his chest ache. Can I tell everyone? Can I tell the other kids and Martha and my teacher and everyone? You can tell whoever you want, Dean said. I want everyone to know you're mine. June was off and running before he could say anything else. Racing through the brownstone yelling, Dean's going to be my dad. He's adopting me. I'm getting a dad. With the uninhibited joy of a child whose greatest wish was coming true, Rose moved to stand beside Dean, both of them watching June share her news with increasing excitement. You know what you've just done, right? You've made a promise to that child that you can never take back. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how complicated life becomes, you've committed to being her father forever. I know, Dean said quietly. And it's the best decision I've ever made. Good, Rose said. Because she's going to hold you to it. Children who've been disappointed before take promises very seriously. You just became responsible for not breaking her heart. I won't, Dean vowed. I've broken a lot of promises in my life, built an empire on strategic lies and calculated betrayals. But not this promise. Not to her. This is the one thing I'm going to get right. He watched June explaining the news to a confused Tommy and an excited Sarah and Rebecca. Watched her glowing with happiness that came from finally being chosen permanently, and understood that he'd just been given something more valuable than all his accumulated wealth and power. He'd been given the chance to be someone's father, someone's hero, someone's forever. And Dean Miller, who'd spent 15 years building walls, finally understood what home actually meant. It wasn't a place. It wasn't possessions or success or control. It was a small girl in a purple coat who'd decided he was worth saving. It was the trust of a child who'd survived trauma and still believed adults could be good. It was the responsibility of being someone's permanent safe place. It was love. Simple, complicated, terrifying, perfect, and Dean was keeping it. 3 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, home visits, and the gradual transformation of Dean's life from isolated empire builder to present father. The social workers were thorough examining his background, his finances, his living situation, his criminal history that existed in spaces the law couldn't quite reach but couldn't quite prosecute either. Rose's advocacy carried weight, as did the obvious bond between Dean and June that even the most skeptical evaluator couldn't dismiss. The court date was set for April 12th, a Friday morning. Judge Catherine Morrison presiding, a family court veteran known for prioritizing children's well-being over procedural convenience. Dean arrived at the courthouse at 8:47 a.m., wearing one of his expensive suits not because it projected power but because June had specifically requested he look fancy for the day she officially became his daughter. Rose and June met him on the steps, June wearing a new purple dress Dean had bought, specifically for this occasion, her hair carefully styled by Rose, her excitement barely contained. Are you nervous? June asked, taking his hand with the natural familiarity that had developed over 3 months of consistent presence. Terrified, Dean admitted honestly. Why? The social worker said we passed all the checks. Rose said, Judge Morrison is nice. Everything's going to be fine. I'm not terrified it won't work, Dean clarified, kneeling to her level despite the expensive suit and the courthouse steps. I'm terrified I won't be good enough at this, that I'll mess up being your dad, that I won't. You'll be perfect, June interrupted with absolute certainty. You're already perfect. You show up every day. You help with homework even though you're terrible at 4th grade math. You make me feel safe. That's what dads do. You're already doing it. Dean pulled her close, breathing through the emotion that threatened to crack his carefully maintained composure. 3 months ago, he'd been standing before toy store windows wishing he could stop existing. Now he was on courthouse steps, about to legally commit to being someone's father. The transformation was so complete, so profound, that sometimes he couldn't quite process it. Ready? Rose asked gently, her hand settling on his shoulder with the maternal warmth she'd extended to him almost as much as to June. Judge Morrison doesn't like people being late. The courtroom was smaller than Dean expected, more conference room than the dramatic spaces he'd seen in movies. Judge Morrison sat behind a modest desk, her gray hair pulled back efficiently, her expression suggesting she'd seen every possible family configuration and was unimpressed by pretense but deeply committed to children's welfare. "Mr. Miller," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before her desk. "Miss Abbott, and this must be June." "Yes, Your Honor," June said with the careful politeness Rose had coached her on. "I'm June Ellis, and I'm going to be June Miller today." Judge Morrison's stern expression softened slightly. "Well, June Ellis, who's going to be June Miller, why don't you tell me why you want Mr. Miller to adopt you?" June glanced at Dean, then back at the judge, her small hands twisting in her lap with nervous energy. "Because he's already my dad. He just isn't officially yet. And I want it to be official so everyone knows he's not going anywhere. So I can tell people my dad instead of my friend Dean. So if something happens, we're legally family, and nobody can separate us." "Those are very mature reasons," Judge Morrison observed. "What makes you think he's already your dad?" "Because he shows up," June said simply. "Every single day since we met. Even when he's busy or tired, or when I'm being difficult, he's there. That's what dads do, they show up. My mom's boyfriend didn't show up. He left when things got hard. But Dean shows up even when things are hard. Especially when things are hard." Judge Morrison turned her attention to Dean. "Mr. Miller, you're a successful businessman. Why do you want to adopt June?" Dean met the judge's assessing gaze directly. "Because she saved my life, Your Honor. 3 months ago, I was standing before a toy store window seriously considering whether existence was worth continuing. I had everything: money, power, success, and none of it meant anything. I was profoundly, dangerously alone. And June saw me. Really saw me. Saw past the expensive coat and the intimidating presence and saw someone who needed kindness. She invited me to dinner. Changed my entire life with 5 words." He paused, finding the words to express something he'd never articulated before. "I'm adopting June, because she's already my daughter in every way that matters. Because thinking about my future without her is impossible. Because protecting her and providing for her and being present for her is the only meaningful thing I've done in 15 years of accumulating meaningless success. Because she deserves a father who chooses her every day, and I want to be that father. Forever." "Forever is a long commitment," Judge Morrison said, "especially given your particular line of work." Dean had prepared for this, had known his background would be scrutinized. "I've delegated operational control of my business, Your Honor. I maintain strategic oversight, but I'm not involved in day-to-day management that would compromise my availability to June. My priority is being her father. The business is secondary." "That's quite a change for a man who built an empire." "The empire was built to fill emptiness," Dean said honestly. "June filled that emptiness with something real. Why would I choose accumulation over actual meaning?" Judge Morrison reviewed the documents before her social worker reports, background checks, Rose's detailed advocacy, June's own written statement about why she wanted Dean as her father. The silence stretched, waited with the understanding that this moment would define both their futures. "Miss Abbott," Judge Morrison said finally, "you've been June's guardian for 3 years. You have legal standing to contest this adoption if you believe it's not in June's best interest. What's your position?" Rose stood, her posture conveying both respect for the court and absolute conviction. "Your Honor, I support this adoption completely. I've watched Dean Miller transform from a man who didn't know how to be present to a father who shows up consistently, who puts June's needs above his own convenience, who has learned to love openly despite that clearly being terrifying for him. June is thriving in ways I haven't seen in 3 years. She's more secure, more confident, more willing to trust that good things can last. That's because of Dean's consistent presence. You understand that if I approve this adoption, you'll no longer be June's legal guardian?" "I understand," Rose said, "and I trust Dean to continue allowing me to be part of June's life. We've discussed custody arrangements that prioritize June's well-being while maintaining the relationship she's built. This isn't about me losing June, this is about June gaining the permanent father she deserves." Judge Morrison was quiet for another long moment, her eyes moving between Dean, June, and Rose. Then she picked up her pen, signing documents with efficient precision that suggested a decision had been made. "Mr. Miller, I'm approving this adoption with several conditions. First, you'll maintain regular contact with Miss Abbott and allow her continued presence in June's life. The bond they've built matters and shouldn't be severed just because legal guardianship is transferring." "Agreed," Dean said immediately. "Second, you'll participate in family counseling. Both of you have trauma that will impact your relationship. Professional support will help navigate that more effectively. Agreed. Third, I want progress reports every 6 months for the first 2 years, not because I doubt your commitment, but because I take children's welfare seriously, and I want confirmation that this arrangement is working as well as everyone hopes. Understood, Your Honor. Judge Morrison set down her pen, her expression softening for the first time since they'd entered. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of New York, I'm granting this petition for adoption. Dean Miller, you are now June's legal father with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. June Ellis, you are now June Miller, legal daughter of Dean Miller. Congratulations to you both. The words took a moment to register. Then June was out of her chair and in Dean's arms with enough force that he had to catch her to avoid falling backward, her small body shaking with sobs that sounded like relief and joy and the release of 3 months of waiting compressed into a single moment. I'm June Miller, she said against his shoulder. I'm your daughter. You're my dad. It's official. It's official, Dean confirmed, his own voice rough with emotion he'd stopped trying to suppress around her. You're mine. Forever. Legally. Permanently. My daughter. Rose was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching the culmination of 3 months of work and prayer and hope that this unconventional family might actually receive official blessing. Judge Morrison, despite her professional demeanor, had suspiciously bright eyes as she gathered her papers. You can pick up the official documents from the clerk's office, the judge said, standing. But Mr. Miller? Dean? One more thing. Dean looked up, still holding June, still processing that this was real, that the small girl in his arms was legally his now. Thank you, Judge Morrison said quietly, for taking this seriously, for recognizing what a privilege it is to be someone's father, for choosing to show up. The world needs more men who understand that power is meaningless if it's not used to protect something that actually matters. You're going to do fine. Thank you, Your Honor. They left the courthouse into spring sunshine, June chattering excitedly about how she was going to tell everyone at school, how she needed to practice her new signature, how they should celebrate with ice cream, even though it was barely 10 a.m. Rose walked beside Dean, her hand finding his with the easy affection that had developed over 3 months of shared parenting. How do you feel? She asked quietly, while June ran ahead to spin in a patch of sunshine. Terrified, Dean admitted. Responsible for another human being, for her happiness, her security, her entire future. What if I mess up? What if I'm not? You'll mess up, Rose interrupted gently. All parents do. But you'll also show up to fix it. That's what matters, not perfection, but presence. Not never making mistakes, but always trying to do better. You've already proven you can do that. June ran back, grabbing both their hands. Can we go to the group home? I want everyone to see the papers. I want to show them I'm officially June Miller now. We can go wherever you want, Dean said. It's your day, sweetheart. Your choice. Then the group home. June decided. Because they're family too. And family should celebrate together. They drove to Morrison Street, June bouncing in the back seat, with the unconstrained joy of a child whose greatest wish had just been fulfilled. The other children were at school, but Martha was there, and her face transformed when she saw them walk in, when June thrust the official adoption papers at her with barely coherent explanation. It's official, June kept saying. Dean's my dad. It's on paper and everything. June Miller. That's me now. Martha pulled Dean into a hug that surprised him with its strength. Congratulations, Father. You've been given something precious. Don't waste it. I won't, Dean promised. They spent the afternoon at the group home, June insisting Dean call his office to tell them the news, then wanting to practice writing her new name over and over, then deciding they needed to take pictures to commemorate the day. Rose captured dozens, June and Dean holding the adoption papers, June showing off her new signature, June explaining to Martha with exaggerated patience that yes, she was still June, just June Miller instead of June Ellis now. As evening approached, Dean found himself on the familiar sagging couch. June curled against his side in comfortable silence after hours of excitement, Rose in the kitchen preparing dinner for when the other children returned from school. Dad? June said quietly, the word still new enough that she was testing it, savoring it. Yeah, sweetheart? Thank you for showing up, for keeping your promises, for being exactly what I hoped you'd be. Dean pulled her closer, breathing through emotion that no longer surprised him but still felt overwhelming in its intensity. Thank you for inviting me to dinner, for seeing me when I was invisible, for deciding I was worth saving. You were always worth saving, June said with absolute certainty. You just needed someone to notice. I'm glad I was the one who noticed. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Later. After dinner with the whole group home family celebrating June's official adoption, after cake that Martha had somehow produced despite minimal notice, after the younger children had been put to bed and the older ones had settled into homework, Dean and June drove to his penthouse. It was June's first time seeing where he lived. He deliberately kept that separation, wanting her to feel secure at the group home before introducing the complication of his wealth. But now, as her legal father, it was time to show her the space he was transforming into something that could actually accommodate a child. June stood in the middle of his living room, turning slowly to take in floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture and views that stretched across the city. "This is where you live?" "This is where I existed," Dean corrected. "But I'm converting the guest room into your bedroom. For the nights you want to stay here instead of at Rose's. For weekends and holidays, and eventually maybe more permanently if you want that." He led her down the hallway, opening the door to what had been generic guest space, but was now partially transformed, walls painted purple per June's specifications, furniture more appropriate for a child, shelves waiting to be filled with books and toys and the accumulated evidence of a life being lived. "It's not finished," Dean said, suddenly nervous about her reaction. "We can change anything you don't like. Paint, furniture, everything. This is your space, and it should feel like yours." June walked through the room slowly, touching the purple walls, testing the bed, examining the shelves. Then she turned to Dean with an expression that was serious despite the day's joy. "This is really mine? Not just for visiting, but actually mine?" "Actually yours," Dean confirmed. "You're my daughter now, June, which means this is your home too. You belong here just as much as you belong at Rose's. You belong wherever I am, forever." June's eyes filled with tears again, the fourth or fifth time that day, but these were different, quieter. The tears of someone who'd been waiting their entire life for confirmation that they truly belonged somewhere, to someone. "I've never had my own room before," she said quietly. "At the group home I share with Sarah and Rebecca. Before that, with my mom, we moved around a lot and I slept wherever there was space. But this is just mine?" "Just yours," Dean confirmed. "Your space, your sanctuary, your home." June crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist with the trust that had become natural over 3 months. "Thank you, Dad. For all of it, for the adoption and the room and showing up and keeping promises and being exactly what I needed." Dean held his daughter, his actual, legal, permanent daughter, and understood with devastating clarity that every choice he'd made in 15 years of building an empire had been leading to this moment, to this room, to this child, to this belonging that money couldn't purchase but presence could earn. "Thank you for giving me a reason to show up," he said quietly. "For deciding I was worth saving. For teaching me what actually matters." They stood there while evening darkened into night, while the city lights came on below them, while spring wind rattled windows that no longer framed isolation but actual home. Dean Miller had a daughter. June Miller had a father, and both of them had finally, permanently, found where they belonged. 6 weeks after the adoption finalized, on a Saturday evening in late May, Dean found himself driving toward Lexington Avenue with June in the passenger seat, her chatter about her week filling comfortable silence that had once felt oppressive. "And then Marcus said that my science project was actually really good," which is big because Marcus never compliments anything, and Miss Percent Patterson wants to submit it to the school fair, which Rose says is a really big deal, and I told her, "Okay, but only if you can come to the fair because it's on a Tuesday, but you said you could take time off for school things." "I'll be there," Dean confirmed, navigating through traffic with the ease of someone who'd driven these streets thousands of times. "Wouldn't miss it." "Good, because it's important that you're there. Sarah's dad never comes to things and she pretends it doesn't matter, but I can tell it does, so I'm glad you come to things. It makes me feel," June paused, searching for words, "it makes me feel chosen. Like you actually want to be there, instead of just showing up because you have to." "I do want to be there," Dean said honestly. "School fairs are more interesting than business meetings." "You're more interesting than business meetings." June grinned. "Everything's more interesting than business meetings, even math homework. That's how boring business meetings are." Dean pulled into a parking space 2 blocks from their destination. June recognized the area immediately, her eyes widening. "This is where we met, where you were standing by the toy store." "I know," Dean said. I thought maybe we should come back, see the display together, full circle." They walked through evening crowds, spring replacing the winter snow, but the energy of the city remaining constant. Shops open late, people hurrying past with shopping bags and phones. The perpetual motion that had once made Dean feel profoundly alone but now just felt like context for the small hand holding his. The toy store window had a new display spring-themed now, with mechanical rabbits in a garden instead of the winter village. But the clockwork figures still moved with metronomic precision, still performed their endless loops, still existed in that automated world Dean had once envied. "That's where you were standing?" June asked, moving to the exact spot Dean had occupied 3 months ago. "Right here?" "Right there," Dean confirmed. Watching the mechanical figures. Feeling, he paused, deciding honesty was better than protection. Feeling like I was trapped in the same kind of loop, going through motions without meaning, existing without living. June looked at the display, then back at him. "And then I found you." "Then you found me," Dean agreed. "And everything changed." "Do you still feel trapped?" June asked, her voice carrying the concern of a child who'd learned to watch for sadness in the adults she loved. "No," Dean said immediately. "Not even slightly. Now I feel—" He searched for words adequate to describe the transformation of the past 3 months. "Now I feel like I finally understand what home means. It's not this building or my penthouse or even the group home. It's you, June. Your home. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." June's expression transformed with the uncomplicated joy that still surprised Dean every time he witnessed it. "That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me. That I'm home. That I'm not just someone to take care of, but actually where you belong." A woman appeared beside them, Rose, arriving separately as planned, her presence completing their small family unit. She stood on June's other side, all 3 of them facing the window display, watching mechanical rabbits tend a mechanical garden with precision that had nothing to do with actual life. "This is where it started," Rose said quietly. "Where June decided a sad stranger needed dinner more than he needed isolation. Best decision I ever made," June said proudly. "Inviting him, seeing him, deciding he was worth saving. Best decision you ever made was seeing someone who needed kindness and offering it without hesitation," Dean corrected. "That takes courage most adults don't have." They stood in silence for a moment, 3 people watching mechanical figures perform automated tasks, understanding with shared certainty that they'd escaped that kind of meaningless repetition. They'd found something real, something chosen, something built through consistent presence rather than programmed behavior. "The Nutcracker used to be here," June said, pointing to where the winter display had been. "In the winter window. Checking his watch forever. That's what you were watching, right? When I found you?" "Yes," Dean confirmed. "The Nutcracker checking a watch that didn't tell time, going through motions that had no purpose. I saw myself in that all motion without meaning, all activity without actual life, just existing, just performing my function without understanding why. But you're not like that anymore," June said with absolute certainty. "Now you have purpose. You're my dad. That's a really important purpose." "The most important," Dean agreed. "The only one that actually matters." Rose's hand found Dean's, her grip warm and maternal. She'd become more than just June's former guardian, she'd become family in ways that went beyond legal definitions. Some nights June stayed at Dean's penthouse, some nights at the group home with Rose. They'd built a flexible arrangement that prioritized June's comfort while maintaining the relationship she needed. It was unconventional, but it worked, which was all that mattered. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked quietly. "Accepting June's invitation? Letting her pull you into our complicated world?" Dean thought about the mechanical Nutcracker, about toy store windows, about 15 years of building an empire that meant nothing, thought about the profound, crushing loneliness that had driven him to standing motionless on winter streets, wishing he could stop existing, thought about the empty penthouse and the meaningless success and the absolute certainty that his life was a loop as pointless as any clockwork mechanism. "Never," he said. "Not once. Not even on the hard days when June's testing boundaries or I'm exhausted from trying to balance fatherhood with business or we're navigating difficult emotions neither of us knows how to handle. Not even then, because hard days with June are infinitely better than easy days alone. Complicated love is better than simple isolation. Messy family is better than perfect emptiness." "Good answer," Rose said, approval in her voice. "Because you're stuck with us now. No returns, no exchanges. You're family permanently." "Good," Dean said. "Permanent is exactly what I want." June was still watching the mechanical rabbits, her small face thoughtful. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "When you were standing here before when you were really sad, did you think things could get better? Did you believe someone might help you?" Dean considered lying, protecting her from the darkness he'd been drowning in, but decided honesty served her better. No, I didn't think things could get better. I'd stopped believing in help or hope or any of the things that make life worth living. I was just existing, going through motions because I didn't know how to stop. But I helped you, June said. Not quite a question, but needing confirmation. You saved me, Dean corrected. You saw someone nobody else was seeing. You offered kindness when I'd forgotten kindness existed. You invited me to dinner and gave me family and taught me that love was real instead of just a concept I'd read about but never experienced. You didn't just help me, June. You completely transformed my life. Then I'm really glad I was there that day, June said solemnly. I'm glad I saw you. I'm glad I was brave enough to talk to you. I'm glad you said yes to dinner, because now I have a dad and you have a daughter and we both have each other. That's pretty perfect. That's perfectly perfect. Dean agreed, pulling her close, Rose's hand still in his, the three of them creating a small island of warmth on a busy street, while mechanical rabbits performed their programmed tasks behind glass. The city moved around them, shoppers hurrying past, cars navigating traffic, the perpetual motion that defined New York. But Dean wasn't moving anymore, wasn't searching, wasn't standing alone before windows wishing for something he couldn't name. He'd found it, had been found by it, had been pulled into it by a small girl in a purple coat who'd decided he was worth saving. Should we get ice cream? June asked, breaking the contemplative silence with typical child logic that decided emotional moments required sugar. There's a place 2 blocks from here that Rose says has the best chocolate chip. Ice cream sounds perfect, Dean agreed. Lead the way. They walked away from the toy store, June between Dean and Rose, both adults holding one of her hands, creating the unbreakable connection of chosen family. Behind them, mechanical rabbits continued their eternal garden work, clockwork figures checking watches that would never tell actual time, automated displays performing their functions without understanding or feeling or any of the messy complexity that made life actually worth living. But Dean didn't look back, didn't need to. That part of his life was over: the isolation, the emptiness, the standing alone before windows. He'd escaped the loop through the simple intervention of a child who'd seen his sorrow and responded with unconditional kindness. Now his life was full, messy, complicated, absolutely perfect. He had a daughter who needed homework, help, and bedtime stories, and someone to show up for school fairs. He had Rose, who'd become co-parent and friend, and the kind of family you chose rather than being assigned. He had the other children at the group home, who'd accepted him with varying degrees of enthusiasm but consistent recognition that June loved him and therefore he must be okay. He had purpose, had meaning, had love that was real and complicated and sometimes terrifying in its vulnerability. He had home, not a place, but people. Not possessions, but presence. Not control, but connection. 3 months ago, Dean Miller had been standing before a toy store window seriously considering whether existence was worth continuing. Had been drowning in success that felt like failure, wealth that purchased nothing meaningful, power that controlled everything except the profound loneliness that defined every moment. Now he was walking toward ice cream with his daughter and her guardian-turned-family, discussing the relative merits of chocolate chip versus mint chocolate chip with the serious attention such important decisions deserved. Now he was planning his week around school fairs and homework help and making sure June felt chosen every single day. Now he was living instead of just surviving, present instead of just existing, home instead of just occupying space. "Dad," June said, tugging his hand to get his attention. "What flavor are you going to get?" "Whatever you recommend," Dean said. "You're the ice cream expert." "Chocolate chip," June said immediately. "It's objectively the best flavor. Rose thinks mint chocolate chip is better, but Rose is wrong about this one thing." "I heard that," Rose said with mock offense. "And mint chocolate chip is superior to chocolate chip in every measurable way." "We'll have to agree to disagree," June said with the diplomatic wisdom of someone who'd learned to navigate adult disagreements. "But Dad will choose chocolate chip because he has good taste." Dean smiled, letting June and Rose debate ice cream flavors with increasing elaboration, content to just be present for this moment, this family, this life he'd accidentally stumbled into and deliberately chosen to keep. The mechanical nutcracker was still checking its watch back at the toy store, still trapped in its eternal loop, still performing functions without understanding. But Dean Miller was free, was chosen, was home, and that was everything. December 23rd arrived with the familiar weight of Christmas approaching, the city decorated with lights and wreaths and all the commercial celebration that had once felt hollow but now felt like context for something real. Dean and June stood before the same toy store window where they'd met exactly 1 year ago. The winter display had returned porcelain children skating endless circles, presents wrapped in paper too perfect to be real, and the mechanical nutcracker checking his eternal watch with metronomic precision. "This is where we started," June said, her voice carrying none of the fear or uncertainty that had defined her a year ago. She was 9 now, taller, more confident, secure in ways that came from being chosen permanently. "Where you were sad and I invited you to dinner." "Best dinner invitation I ever received," Dean said, his arm around her shoulders, no longer surprised by the casual affection that had become natural over 12 months of consistent presence. "Do you ever feel sad like that anymore?" June asked, watching the nutcracker's repetitive gesture. "Like you're trapped and nothing matters?" "Never," Dean said honestly. "Some days are hard. Some days I'm tired or frustrated or don't know how to handle whatever problem we're navigating. But I never feel meaningless, because I'm your dad. That's meaning enough for a lifetime." Rose appeared beside them, completing their family unit that had solidified over a year of shared parenting, school events, holidays spent together, and the gradual building of routines that defined them more than any legal document. Marcus and the other group home children were at the movies, a Christmas tradition Dean had funded and would join them for later, but these 3 had wanted this moment first. 1 year, Rose said, looking at the display with the same wonder Dean felt. 1 year since a small girl decided a sad stranger needed family more than he needed isolation. "Best decision ever," June said proudly. "I saved Dad. He says so all the time." "We saved each other," Dean corrected, pulling her closer. "You taught me what home actually means, that it's not places or possessions but people who choose you. People who show up. People who decide you're worth loving even when you don't believe it yourself." A child walked past with her parents, laughing at something her father said, the sound of uncomplicated joy that June now embodied more often than not. The mechanical figures continued their programmed routines behind glass: check, watch, nod, reset, repeat. The eternal loop that had once mirrored Dean's existence but now just seemed sad in its predictability. "I'm glad you stopped here that day," June said quietly. "I'm glad you were watching these figures. Because if you hadn't been standing right here, right when I walked past, we might never have met, and that would have been terrible. That would have been catastrophic," Dean agreed. "For both of us, you saved me from a life that looked successful but felt empty. I got to help save you from a crisis that threatened your security. We found each other at exactly the right moment. The universe provides," Rose said, quoting something she'd told June countless times. "Sometimes in unexpected ways. Sometimes through small girls in purple coats who notice sad strangers and offer them soup." They stood together watching mechanical figures perform their automated tasks. 3 people who'd built a family from compassion and consistency, and the simple decision that belonging mattered more than isolation. The city moved around them with its characteristic chaos, but they created a small island of warmth and certainty in the perpetual motion. "Should we go?" June asked. "The movie starts in 20 minutes and Marcus will be mad if we're late because he wants good seats." "Let's go," Dean agreed. "Don't want to upset Marcus." They walked away from the toy store for the second time in their shared story. June, between her 2 parents, one biological guardian turned family, one adopted father turned everything, both holding her hands, creating the unbreakable connection of people who'd chosen each other deliberately. Behind them, the mechanical nutcracker checked his watch with unchanging precision. The porcelain children skated their endless circles. The automated winter village continued its programmed celebration, but Dean Miller was no longer trapped in meaningless loops, no longer performing functions without understanding, no longer existing without living. He had a daughter who needed him at movies and school fairs, and all the mundane moments that defined actual life. He had Rose, who trusted him with her ward and become his partner in raising an extraordinary child. He had a family built through choice rather than obligation, through presence rather than genetics, through love that was real and complicated and absolutely perfect. He had home, not as a place he occupied, but as people he belonged to and who belonged to him. Not as safety from the world, but as connection within it. Not as isolation disguised as independence, but as vulnerability disguised as strength. 1 year ago, Dean Miller had been standing before a toy store window, wishing he could stop existing because existing felt pointless. Now he was walking toward a Christmas movie with his daughter and her guardian-turned-family, discussing whether popcorn or candy was superior theater food with the serious attention such important decisions deserved. Now he was living instead of surviving, loving instead of isolating, home instead of lost. And all of it, every moment of meaning, every second of belonging, every instance of choosing to show up, all of it had started with 5 words from a small girl in a purple coat. "Don't be sad, sir. You can eat with us." The invitation that saved his life. the kindness that transformed everything. The moment a mechanical existence became actual living, Dean looked down at June, at her animated explanation of why chocolate beats all other candy options, at the security in her posture that came from being chosen permanently, at the love in her eyes that he'd somehow earned through simple presence. "I love you, June Miller," he said, interrupting her candy dissertation. "I love you too, Dad," she replied, the words natural now, no longer tested but simply true. "Thanks for saying yes to dinner that day. Thanks for keeping your promises. Thanks for being exactly what I needed. Thank you for seeing me," Dean said, "for inviting me, for teaching me what home actually means." "That's what daughters do," June said, with the confident wisdom of a 9-year-old who decided something was true. "They save their dads, and dads save them back. That's how family works." Rose smiled, squeezing both their hands. "That's exactly how family works." They walked through snowy streets toward a movie theater full of children who'd become Dean's extended family, toward Christmas celebrations that had meaning because they were shared, toward a future built on presence rather than power. And Dean Miller, who'd spent 15 years building an empire that meant nothing, finally understood what actually mattered. Not success, not wealth, not control over territories and businesses, and people who feared him, but a small girl who'd decided he was worth saving, a guardian who'd trusted him with what mattered most. A family built through choice and maintained through showing up. Home. Simple, complicated, perfect. Forever.